Hello viewers, I'm James May and this is The Reassembler, the show where we take everyday objects in their component form and put them back together very slowly. That feels very nice. Oh yes, look at that. It is only when these much-loved and iconic objects are laid out in hundreds of bits, oh man in heaven, and then slowly reassembled that you can truly understand and appreciate how they work, total rubbish, and just how ingenious they are. It's good, isn't it? And if painstakingly putting hundreds of pieces back together again, that's quite satisfying, wasn't hard enough, I then have to hope, deep joy, that they'll work. There's some moisture on my spectacles because I've started weeping. Welcome to Virtual Reality 1970s Spec. This is a 1971 Triang Hornby Flying Scotsman train set, the perfect miniature railway. And it was absolutely brilliant because you just plugged the track together, wired up the transformer, plonked the locomotive and the coaches on the track, and off it went. But not here, because it's been dismantled into its 138 component parts. And this is my Flying Scotsman with realistic chuffing sound train set, which I have owned for over 40 years. Now, as this train set is powered by electricity, or as it was still known in the 70s, the miracle of electricity, I thought we'd start with the electric motor, which is these components here. And what would be really handy is if we had something like a little plastic tub to put bits in whilst I walk to the bench. Something like that. So, there we go, that's the frame of the motor. That is the armature and the rotor. Bolt or screw, we'll come on to that discussion in a minute, to hold it together. Back plate and magnet. What we have here is actually one of the most numerously produced miniature electric motors in history. This series of motors is known as the XO series, and it's a rather elegant thing. This is the frame. This is the rotor with the armature on it and the commutator. We'll come on to all that in excruciating detail in a minute. It's quite delicate. There's a few things you need to be careful of. Notably, there's windings on each part of the armature there, and the very end of the tiny copper wire is soldered onto the commutator. The purpose of the frame, apart from holding the whole thing together, is that it allows the magnetic field of the magnet, which we're going to put in a minute, to move down the motor and surround the coils. This is all based on EMF, electromotive force, which is what makes the motor work. And the commutator is there to renew the current to it each time it moves through one segment. There you go. The first train set I got for Christmas was when I was very small, so it must have been about 1968. It was actually second-hand because we were poor, but we were happy. The train set was actually from the 50s, and this one came later. This is a much more advanced train set, but by modern standards, it's still very, very simple, but rather gloriously simple in my view, because the thing about Triang trains, from which this set stemmed, again, we'll come on to the naming of the company a bit later on, but the thing is, the reason so many of us had the Triang and later Triang Hornby and Hornby Railways train sets was because they were fantastically good value. That is one of the reasons they triumphed. The other was that they were absolutely brilliant. Although this is very crude by modern standards, it's still a rather gorgeous piece of miniature engineering. The commutator relies on being very clean. It is fairly clean on this one, but we can clean it a bit more with a brilliant thing I've got here. This is a fiberglass pencil. They're used by people who muck about with small electrical things. It's very good as a means of polishing things up very, very fine. So you can use it on copper contacts and so on, and you can use it on the commutator of the motor. Again, being very careful not to catch the little copper bits. Clean, bright and tight is the maxim of old electrical engineers. Most of them are dead now, so don't worry about it. You see the fibre bristles polish that copper up quite nicely. That makes a huge difference. Well, I've actually mended a lot of these trains because the tragedy of these is that a lot of people sort of my age and a bit younger have these in the loft and have dug them out thinking, my children will play with these like I did when I was a boy. And of course, when they're shown them, they look up from Pokemon Go for half a second and go, yes, Dad, that's fascinating. But then, of course, Dad wants to play with them. But the trouble is, after they've been in a loft for 20 or 30 years, they don't work because they have congealed oil on them and so on, and contacts have come apart, you know, dry joints and so on. They're quite easy to restore, and I've done quite a few for other people. It's because I haven't got any proper friends. I think we'll put the magnet in next. I'm going to show you something really brilliant that somebody gave me. It is a remagnetizing device. No, it isn't. That's a polishing kit from the man who owns this workshop. Who's moved my magnetizing? So that is a small magnet remagnetizer. Magnets are weird things, really, because in some ways magnetism is similar to electricity, but in other ways it isn't. For example, you can't really insulate magnetism. That was one of those very smug things that physics teachers used to say in the olden days. And study of magnets goes back to, well, the scientific revolution and before that. A bloke called Gilbert wrote a Latin treatise, De Magnet, if I remember rightly. And in early days, as part of the mechanical philosophy, I think it was thought that magnetism was actually a flow of particles, quite literally, that knocked things into alignment or out of alignment. We now understand it slightly differently from that. But the important piece of kit in this box is a compass, because magnets have a north and a south pole, and you have to get the magnet the right way around in the motor. Not that that makes any difference to it running. It will run whichever way around the magnet is. But if you don't have all your magnets in all your trains around the same way, then when you select forward on your control box, some trains will go forwards and some will go backwards. So the convention is north goes to the top. So that end, which attracts the red end, is the north pole of the magnet. And I can tell you, just with a simple screwdriver test, that that magnet is pretty weak. So we'll remagnetize it. So this device is marked on this side. North goes that way. So you put that between the two bars, the two pole pieces. Now, it's thought that sharks are repelled by magnets, so if you always go swimming in the Bahamas with a train set, you'll be fine. Here we go. Ready? It's very exciting. That's it. However, I bet you, but I can already feel that that's much stronger than it was. And to do our little screwdriver test, if I put that there, take the same screwdriver, I can now, there you go, look, I can pick it up. That's how much better the magnet is. And that will make the motor more powerful and less prone to overheat, because it will actually draw less current that way. Now, to hold that in place is this. That begs a fascinating question that you can take down to the pub with you later. Is that a screw or is it a bolt? Now, one definition says that a bolt is not threaded all the way up, as indeed this one isn't. It has a plain shank because its main function is as a dowel to line things up, which this does because it passes through the hole in the magnet and keeps it all in alignment. A bolt is secured by a nut, which we also have here. So technically that, I think, is a bolt. The definition of a screw, or one definition of a screw, is that it passes through a component and screws into another component. So say the screw that goes through the engine case on a chainsaw and then screws into the body of it, that's a screw. Another definition says that it's a screw if it's threaded all the way along its length, and a bolt if part of it is not threaded. Another definition says that if it's small, it's a screw, because a bolt can't be small. But I think technically that's a bolt. Right, the 8BA spanner, very old British standard, goes on that end, and we have to put the what's called a hairpin spring, which is going to hold the brushes. I'll explain all this in a minute. And I mean, I can hear you screaming, no, please don't, but I'm going to anyway. It's a nicely designed little screw stroke bolt, because it has another shoulder on it that means the spring remains free, even though it's in place. And you can now feel, you can't feel because you're watching the television, but I can feel that now the magnet is in place and remagnetized, instead of that spinning freely, it now moves in a series of little clunks, because there's a magnetic field in there. That's fab, isn't it? This is isopropyl alcohol. It's the stuff that goes on those swabs that they put on your arm before they give you an injection, sometimes known as rubbing alcohol. I think this might be what surgical spirit is as well. That's a very old-fashioned term that my grandmother used to use. It evaporates very quickly. If you buy it as surgical swabs, they cost about £1 each. If you buy it in a tin like that, it costs about £4 for more than you'll ever use in your lifetime. This is a great workshop moment. If you do this, you have a cup of tea and a glass of terps or meths or isopropyl alcohol and you're talking, at some point you will drink the cleaner and not the tea. So let's have a convention that says that goes there and the cup of tea goes there. The brushes are made of copper, have blobs of carbon on the end to transfer electricity to the commutator. These are quite grubby. I'm going to use the fibre pencil again and dip it in the alcohol, which is a thorough but benign cleaner. It won't damage anything. See? Filth. The enemy of electricity. Whatever electricity is, nobody really knows, of course. That goes through there. And I've got to put the other one in. I can barely see it myself. I'm so blind these days. There you go. Now, the interesting thing actually about a toy train from this era, we're talking about the early 1970s, it is exactly at that time that the video games started to emerge. Things like the very first Ataris. In fact, at home we had the very early TV tennis game with the two white paddles that went... I mean, it was rubbish, but it was exciting if you'd never seen anything like that before. And things like model railways went into quite sharp decline in the 70s for that reason. And in fact, there was a sort of a change of mood amongst the people who made these train sets, because they had been toys, as I said earlier on, but after that period, they gradually started to realise that what they were for was for slightly nostalgic and sad, disappointed old men. I've got hundreds. Right, what we can do at this point is bring out the transformer, and we can actually test that that motor runs. Wires and a couple of handy croc clips attached to the transformer, and if I've done this right, we should be able to make the motor spin. Brilliant, isn't it? Well, it would be very cliche to say at this point, of course, young people these days don't know how to make their own entertainment with a train set or Scale Extric or Airfix or whatever, because they've just got their noses in computers all the time. But actually, if I were 9 years old today, I'd be absolutely thrilled to bits with an iPad. I think it's just fantastic. The internet is the most significant thing that's happened in my lifetime by a massive margin. And if I could have had all that stuff with flight simulators and pocket monsters and so on, I'd have been delighted. I'd have still played with this because I like mechanical things, but I'm not going to suggest that the decline in this has ruined humanity, because it simply isn't true. These are nice, they're gorgeous, I love them, but we moved on, I'm afraid. So there you go, that is a complete X04 motor. A simple thing, but for 4 decades plus, a maker of dreams.
It may have taken me 2 hours and 33 minutes, but that's the motor done. So now I can get some more bits.
Right, so next we're going to do the chassis and the main driving wheels, and there is a great deal to talk about here because it's one of the bits that you can get utterly wrong on this. It will never ever run properly if you get this wrong. That bush, that's it. Step this way. Now, the interesting thing about a real steam locomotive is that the pistons go backwards and forwards in the cylinders, but the wheels go round and round, and that's because the wheels, of course, are cranked. The connecting rods drive them not in the centre, but off-centre. So it works exactly the same way as, say, a treadle-operated sewing machine. The problem with that is that if the locomotive came to rest like that, or like that, so that the crank is exactly in line with the cylinder, the piston would be at one end and it couldn't start because it needs to be off-centre for the crank to have its effect. And obviously you can't give it a little push to get it going because it weighs something like 85 tonnes, the Flying Scotsman. So what they did was they offset the cranks from side to side by usually 90 degrees. And that means that you can't come to a halt with both the pistons at top or bottom dead centre, i.e. at the extremes of their travel. One of them is always going to be somewhere in the middle at the very least, so the thing will always be able to start moving. Now, that isn't an issue with the toy train because it's driven by an electric motor, but in fact we do quarter the wheels, to use the correct expression, because it does smooth out the running. Otherwise you will get tight spots and your train will go like that.
And to do the very important wheel quartering, I will use the rather exciting and aptly named wheel quartering jig. This is exhilarating stuff.
See, a lot of people think that toy trains is just a sad thing. You know how people like to describe things as, oh, that's well sad. And that's probably said about toy trains more than anything else in the world. But I don't think it's entirely true because some very rock and roll-y people have great enthusiasm for toy trains, like Rod Stewart, for example. He had leopard skin trousers, so you can't really knock him. Neil Young, Missy Elliott's got a massive train set. That's not true, actually, I just made that up, but... This is so fiddly, I'm not actually speaking, which I know is a joy for many of you. I can hear you at home saying, I wish you'd do more fiddly things. Hornby used to have an advert, a print advert, appeared in magazines that had a little boy, obviously on Christmas Day, surrounded by wrapping paper, and he's holding his toy train and said, "Core, it's a real Hornby train set, thanks, Dad." There's never any suggestion that Mum would have bought him a train set, because how could she possibly have understood such things? She was a woman and they still didn't have opinions in the 70s. I'm sorry if I seem to be labouring the point a bit here, but it is so important that you get these squared up and lined up exactly right. Otherwise we will be rewarded with the misery of a train that doesn't run properly. And we get too much of that in real life. We don't want it in toys as well. If I can be brutally honest, I was never a serious railway modeller or anything like that. I wasn't interested in building scenery or populating it with imaginary people. I just wanted it to work properly. And usually they didn't work properly because I'd already taken them to bits when they were already working perfectly well in the first place. But, you know, such is the nature of the deeply inquisitive mind. There you go, that's rather triumphant, isn't it? They're square, they're offset by 90 degrees. That is what the reassembler is all about, attention to detail. Oh, it's difficult to see both sides at the same time, but that crank pin is at the top. Yeah, that one is displaced by precisely 90 degrees. And I hope you're still watching. There are 4 more of those to do. Well, it's done, and it works. That is the trickiest part of it, to be honest. Next, we can go and get the connecting rods, put those on, and check that I've done the quartering correctly. If I can push it along like that smoothly, I've got it right. If it goes like that, turn over to channel 4. Let's go.
So now I'm going to take the connecting rods, the cylinder block, the valve screws, and the spacer.
Right, watch this, I bet you can't wait. Right, I'm finally able to put away that wheel quartering jig thing, which I don't like, if I'm honest, because I find it very intimidating, partly because my instincts tell me that all the hardcore model railway people watching this will be going, oh, you don't want to do it like that, you want to use an Allen Gibson wheel compressor, or in my day. Earlier on I promised you that I would explain to you or clear up the confusion over the names Hornby, Triang and Triang Hornby, and it's quite complicated, but here it comes. The original Hornby trains were O-gauge tinplate clockwork toys. They were quite big, and they were the work of Frank Hornby, who was also the inventor of Meccano, and they were made in Liverpool. And in 1938, Hornby made Hornby 00, which was half the size, 00, half the size of O-gauge. And that was quite successful. They were very, very nice metal model trains, very expensive. Excuse me, I'm just looking for my very exciting new screwdriver that I've got. Anyway, they were reasonably successful, but they were very expensive. They were generally for posh kids. My mate Steve, for example, who came from a very posh family, had Hornby 00. And then in the 1950s, a company called Rovex Plastics invented a toy train set 00 gauge again for Marks and Spencer's, and it was quite revolutionary because it was made of injection moulded plastic, which was a newfangled thing. And they made it quite cheaply. They only made, I think, a few hundred sets before they realised it didn't work very well. That was when Lines Brothers, who ran the Triang toy empire, saw what they'd done, bought the company, refined the idea and gave us Triang trains. So you had Hornby 00, which were the expensive posh ones made out of die-cast metal. You had Triang, which were made out of the newfangled plastics and were much more toy-like. They had interchangeable parts. They sacrificed absolute accuracy in the interests of productivity and low prices and play value, as we would say now. Now, what happened next... I'm just going to have to pause because I can't find my new screwdriver. It's such an exciting screwdriver, you're going to want to see it. Because, if you're watching the last series, you'll remember those magic gripping screws. Yeah! gripping screwdriver, and I managed to find one for sale on eBay. There it is. We're going to use that in a minute. Where had I got to? Yes, so in the 1960s, the Meccano empire, which had Hornby 00 in its stable, went bust, and it was bought by Lines Brothers, the owner of the Triang empire, and they promised all the toy train enthusiasts, we will merge the Triang toy trains with the Hornby 00 series model trains. And they didn't really. They plucked a few bits from the Hornby 00 range, but mainly they just got the name. Now, it then became Triang Hornby, and that was to placate the enthusiasts. That's all it was. It was still really the Triang toy trains empire. But the weird thing was, in 1972, Lines Brothers went bust because the world was going mad and there were strikes and there was an oil crisis and all the rest of it. And the trains division lost the right to use the Triang name, but they still had the right to use the Hornby name, even though there wasn't really any of Hornby in the train. So they became Hornby Railways, and now they're simply called Hornby. But actually, the trains we get today are the descendants of the original Triang trains and the plastic train set that was made for Marks & Spencer's in 1950. I hope that was useful. Right, what we're going to do now is, because a lot of people do get this wrong and they say, oh no, I didn't have Triang, I had a Hornby train set, but they didn't. They actually had a Triang one. It was just called Hornby. Hornby had gone. The Hornby trains were lovely. The tooling was sold to GWR Wren, and they became Wren Railways, which was also actually a division of the Triang empire. So the whole toy business is very incestuous. I mean, never mind that. Look at this. Here's the brass screw that has to go in there to hold that extension in place. There is my new gripping screwdriver. Very difficult to find. If you watch the first series of the Reassembler, and I can't imagine why you wouldn't have done really, unless you were Tim Watts' name and you were in outer space, you will remember that we put together an old GPO telephone, and I was lent some gripping screwdrivers, which I'd never used before, and I thought they were fantastic. And they turn out to be very rare and very difficult to find, but there is an American company that makes them, and I managed to find one on eBay. I found several for sale in the States, and they're very expensive, of course, because they have to be posted to Britain. But there was one bloke had one in Britain, this one, and he knew what it was. He says it's a clever gripping screwdriver, and nobody else bid on it apart from me, so I got it for about £5, which you're probably thinking that's a huge amount for a screwdriver, but not for a screwdriver that changes your life. Okay? Shut up. Right, whilst I was telling you all that, the chassis extension went in, and you didn't even notice. This is a moment of truth, because we're going to find out if my wheel quartering is accurate. Right, this is a connecting rod. You see the hole in the middle goes on the crank pin. The two pins at the ends, they go into the holes on the other driving wheels. That should all line up very neatly, does it? Yes. Now, if I do the one on the other side, we will discover that my quartering is absolutely spot on. Here we go. Okay. If I've got this wrong, my reputation's just mud. They're not secured yet, there's lots more to go on, but we'll give it an initial test. Oh, man in heaven. Does anybody else want to feel that? Rebecca, you're closest. Come on. Just push it gently there, you feel not a tight spot in it, agreed?
Agreed.
Good, thank you. Here is a train assembling top tip. If you don't have a screwdriver magnetizer and you don't have one of these rather rare gripping screwdrivers, this one's a bit too big anyway, have a lip salve. If you put a tiny speck of that on the end of your screwdriver, it's usually just sticky enough to hold on to that screw while you manoeuvre it into position. And then, delirium tremens notwithstanding, deep breath, it's in. One day I scratched my face with my screwdriver and I suddenly realised I could pick up small screws. No, that's bad. My tweezers have become slightly magnetised. We just need to put the tiniest smear of lubricant on all those motion gear parts. The rule of oil, according to the old engineers, was that it should be felt but not seen. You should know it's on there, but you shouldn't be able to see. Who wants to feel it this time? Nobody? Someone. Sounds.
That's nice, isn't it?
It's nice, isn't it? I mean, it's a good job we're not all ambitious, otherwise the world would be a very ugly place.
It's been 4 hours and 20 minutes since we started, and I've only assembled the motor, chassis and drive wheels. But as soon as I've connected the electrical collector plate, things will begin to move on a pace. Honest.
Well, this train is almost ready to run under its own power. I'll have to put the motor in as well. It's not a complete locomotive yet. It looks ridiculous. It doesn't have the body or the pony truck or the bogie on, but it's got all the bits that would make it go round and round the track. When I was a kid, there was a great deal of excitement in putting the reassembled train on the track for the first time, but to be honest, usually disappointment, because I wasn't as good at this when I was a kid. I often didn't have the right tools, even though the Triangle was used to be able to claim you could service these with 3 tools. I think it was a struggle to do a complete strip down and rebuild, unless you had proper stuff like I've got here. So usually it didn't work, and then usually my dad would have to help me, or, you know, it would come apart a bit, and then it would come apart completely, and then quite a lot of it disappeared into the vacuum of the vacuum, never to be seen again. Biggest problem with these was always that they got fluff stuck in them. People would send them back to the factory saying, my train doesn't work anymore, there's something terribly wrong, and all it would be was a load of carpet. Now, it still runs smoothly. Okay, we're going to put the motor in and attach the connections, which should, with a bit of luck, make it come alive. Now, this is always a slightly tricky job because we need to put this one screw, it's a brass screw, through the end of the motor plate to attach it to the chassis. And the problem is always that it's difficult because your screwdriver keeps sticking to the magnet. What you should really do is have a brass screwdriver, which I used to have and I can't find it, but these days I've got my gripping screwdriver, which will help with the job. It's still sticking to the magnet, but at least it's not jumping out of the screw. It's a 12-volt train, and it generally draws at the most about 1/4 of an amp, maybe a bit more if your magnet's slightly ropey. It's perfectly safe. Some of the early electric toy trains weren't. They ran off really rather big voltages and blew children up quite regularly, but children were cheap in the olden days, so it didn't matter. When I was a lad, I lost most of my mates to train sets. Now, a feature that Triang introduced, I think it was during the Triang years, and it extended into the Triang Hornby years, but it wasn't used very much, and it was quite short-lived, is this glowing firebox feature. It is just a little light bulb behind a little piece of coloured semi-translucent plastic there. So the bulb is on behind. It gives a sort of a yellowy-orange glow, as if the fire is burning in the locomotive. This was very innovative in its time. You have to remember that a lot of things hadn't been invented then. There were no computer games, none of that stuff that, you know, we'd spend all our time on these days. You young people don't realise how lucky you are. I think this was short-lived because, to be honest, it was a bit fiddly, and I think it reduced the effectiveness of the motor slightly as well. But it's here, so we'll have it. All that is a bulb, so we have to have a feed from both sides. There's a clip taking it from the insulated side, if I can work this other one in here. It's always tricky. We will have a feed to the other side, and we should see the bulb come on. Right, so where you're looking is there. I don't know if it's going to be dark enough for you to see it. You ready? Glowing firebox. Like it? I'm sorry, there's some moisture on my spectacles because I started weeping when I saw that going. I mean, I am not the same person as I was when I was 9 years old because, as we know, biologically we are constantly regenerated, and there are very few molecules in me now that were in me then, but this train is still the same thing, made out of the same stuff. Look at that. That's all it does. This is not a rare or collectible train. To be honest, very few Triang trains are really valuable and collectible. The reason being simply that they were massively successful and they made tens of thousands of them, in some cases hundreds of thousands. And that's a good thing. We don't want them to be collectible and valuable and put in cupboards. We want them to be played with even now, because that was exactly what they were intended for. They're toys. But the descendants of these actual trains that we're talking about here are now fragile models that you have to handle very carefully. These things weren't. They were designed to be kicked around. It was a toy. It was an impression of the real thing, good enough to spark the thought of it in your imagination. It didn't need to be literal. That's what makes these artworks. They are impressions, actually. Now, I think I'm right in saying that this one at the front is called a bogie. That's those bits and those wheels. And then this one at the back, this is known as a pony truck. And I don't quite know why, but the general rule seems to be that on locomotives, bogies lead, pony trucks follow, which is odd because ponies lead traps. I don't know, I could be completely wrong about that. We'll talk some more about this over here. This will now accelerate towards its conclusion or closure, as they would say in business. These wheels are just a press fit, like a lot of stuff was on these toys. Makes it joyously easy to put that bit together. Do you know that in the when these were still made in Britain, down in Margate, the vast majority of the assembly workforce were women, because they were thought to be A, better at it, and B, they had nicer, slenderer fingers, as a general rule, so they could handle these little bits. It was also considered a very pucker job to work for Triang and Hornby Railways assembling trains, because everybody loved them. They were important. They were part of the fabric of society. Can you see how much more trainy that's looking? Now that bit's on. Wait till you see this bit. It's going to go in there onto the little shoulder on the screw, and those, by the way, are screws, definitely not bolts, because they go through a component and then screw into a thread on another component, not a nut. So that's a screw. Nobody cares.
I'm 6 hours and 21 minutes into my reassembly. I've constructed the motor and the drive wheels, and I've attached the motor and glowing firebox to the chassis, which means I can return to the glorious table of bits.
What we are going to assemble next is something that was deeply innovative back in the day. It is the locomotive tender with, are you ready, realistic chuffing sound. Now, that may not sound like much, and it wasn't much. You young people today are used to having the equivalent of all the world's libraries in your pocket. We had a little metal clip that acted against a piece of sandpaper and made a noise vaguely like a steam locomotive, and we were happy. We weren't, actually. We were bloody miserable because the 70s were awful. Nothing worked properly. The lights were always going out. Everything was filthy. The food was terrible. Parents were largely drunk. Rained a lot as well. You might have thought that I would go to the table then and pick up the body of the locomotive and put it on so it looked complete, and normally I suppose I would, but I wanted to save that until later because it's sort of when it becomes complete and whole. We'll put that to one side and talk about the tender. That is the colour of the LNER A3 Flying Scotsman in the gloss finish, which Triang Hornby introduced very briefly in 1971. It's one way we can date this one. Now, the tender chassis features, as I mentioned earlier, the realistic chuffing sound. And please be aware that at its time, this was the sort of magic ringtone, the fashionable computer jingle of its day. Whole families would come round to our house at the weekend to hear the realistic chuffing sound from the Flying Scotsman tender. And I'll explain to you how it works. Inside the tender is that. It is a miniature sound box. It's really the way a violin works, only a lot cruder. You can see how this can be turned into a realistic chuffing sound. You see, on a violin, well, any string instrument, and a guitar, in fact, The string itself, just stretched along a piece of wood, wouldn't make a great deal of noise, but the box amplifies it. That's exactly what happens with the string of a violin. The body of the violin amplifies the sound. The little curly slots in it let it out. That's a very, very crude version of what I'm talking about. I just have to carefully remind myself how it all goes together. Yep. This model of the Flying Scotsman, you will notice, has the so-called corridor tender. This is so that when the Flying Scotsman did non-stop runs from London up to Scotland, a second crew could be having a snooze in the coaches and they could walk through the coaches all the way through the tender. There was a tunnel through the middle and emerge onto the footplate to drive the train. And then the other crew could retire. Brilliant. They could also pick up water on the move because of the trough system and so on. They really thought about this stuff. I suppose the Flying Scotsman is the most famous steam locomotive in British Railways history. Maybe it was because it was a good name, it came in a series of great colour schemes. I think it's mainly that it looked great. It wasn't the only one of its class. There were other locomotives that looked exactly the same. It was the first locomotive to be recorded hauling a passenger train at more than 100 miles an hour. A lot of people don't realise this, but it does hold a speed record. Mallard eventually held the outright steam record in 1937 or 8, 127.6 miles an hour. Some people think a German train may have beaten it, but anyway, let's not argue about that. It's like the 1966 World Cup. Boring. Listen, it realistically chuffs in reverse as well, and it chuffs in proportion to its speed. Should we put the coaches together? Well, the next bit is very simple. I'm going to assemble all the coaches, which are really quite simple because to a large extent they don't come apart. A lot of the bits are riveted together, like the bogies and so on, and a lot of them are made in single plastic injection mouldings. So this will be the work of minutes, and there's something slightly odd going on here because I think originally this set had 2 coaches. That's how it came, and those 2 are this one and that one, with the separate axles and wheels. And then somehow I picked up a 3rd coach somewhere in childhood, which is that one, which must be slightly later because it's got the one-piece plastic wheel. So that's a bit of an imposter, but I included it anyway because it's how I remember it. 4 axles per coach there. 2 retaining screws and the chassis. Right, this will take mere minutes. What we're assembling here are the teak coaches of the LNER, the London and North Eastern Railway, post-grouping, which was 1923, I think, but pre-nationalisation, which was 1968. Right enough, I've got that wrong. This is yet more evidence that this is the Flying Scotsman set plus an extra coach. I've got 2 brake coaches, which obviously you wouldn't have on a real train, and one of them has a slightly different coloured roof look. This is like sort of industrial archaeology. And I was going to say, actually, since the train set was one of the greatest Christmas presents I ever got, I can also tell you what was the worst, I think, which was a combined folding shoehorn and clothes brush. And I can't remember who bought it for me or why. I mean, it's the last thing in the world I would ever use, and I've still got it in that dark drawer of nothingness that's at the bottom of a wardrobe. It's never even been unfolded, actually, let alone used. And I'd like to tell you about my mate. Well, I'm not going to use his real name in case he's watching. Let's call him Bill. Bill, at the age of 10, desperately wanted a train set. And about 2 weeks before his birthday, he saw his birthday present in his parents' bedroom, wrapped up. It was a train set-shaped box. They were, they were distinctive. You knew what a train set looked like. And he spent 2 sleepless weeks thinking about his train set that he'd wanted for so long. And on the morning of his birthday, he came downstairs, and his parents, being sort of quite old-fashioned and proper, said, well, you can't have your present yet, you must have your breakfast first. So he had a boiled egg and a piece of toast and all this stuff while he slowly wet himself with excitement. And then his parents says, right, you can open your present now. And he tore the wrapping paper off the box to reveal a picture framing kit. But the real tragedy of it was that my mate Bill was left-handed, so he couldn't use it anyway because it was designed for right-handed people. And he will rejoice in telling you that the following year, to make amends, his parents bought him a pair of ducks as pets. Not that he particularly wanted any, but he did the decent thing and he put them in the greenhouse and fed them and made friends with them so that they would get to know him. And then eventually came the day when he could let them out into the garden and they could go in the pond, and they flew away. I still ring him up on his birthday every year to say, "Are you gloomy?" And he goes, "Oh, yes." And he's always got a terrible gift of some sort. Right, that's all there is to it. It's sort of snapped together.
So, once I've attached the wheels and assembled the rest of the carriages, we're laughing.
We have a train. When you look at old pictures of railway travel, especially pictures of the insides of coaches from the 20s and 30s, even the 50s, in fact, you realise that they became very, very luxurious, very ornate. The first-class carriages would have wood panelling and lights on the tables with little frilly shades over them and ornate, almost like candelabras, but with electric lights in them. Doilies, tablecloths, people would be very, very smartly dressed. It was all extremely aristocratic, but that was a massive contrast with the medieval toil being endured by the people who actually had to drive the locomotive, because I've had a go at it, firing it and driving it, and it's horrendous. It's like something Hieronymus Bosch would have come up with and then thought, no, that's too ridiculous. Hell can't actually be that bad. I better tone it down a bit. And people sort of lament the passing of the steam era and say, oh, it was fantastic when you had the 462 and the 460 and the Britannia class and so on. But they were just inefficient. They made a terrible mess. They were awful for the people who drove them. And the idea that you went from that and then got into a diesel electric where you pressed a button and then just moved a lever and sat there in the warm with the windscreen wiper clearing the window right in front of you, it must have been fantastic. I think we probably hung on to steam longer than we should have done. It was a very, very outdated idea by the time we got rid of it, and that was in my lifetime. And I know you're all going to now tweet and go, well, that's because you're 300 years old. It's not that long ago. People were still driving things like that, shoveling coal, pulling hot levers, having sparks blow on them, burning their hands, cooking meat and potato pie on the top of the firebox. Just terrible. What shall I do next? Shall we actually put the body shell on the locomotive, and then it will be a complete Flying Scotsman? Do you fancy that? Right, I think this is philosophically quite an important moment, because as I put the body shell, that's not really a proper railway term, but it's what it is, I'll put the body shell on, and then it hides all the things that reveal that this is really just a trick, and it becomes a locomotive. Are you ready? And there it is. Flying Scotsman. How brilliant is that? Sorry, should we see if it works? Put the track together. Now, of the 138 parts we started with, we should have 8 there, because that makes a complete circle. Yes, it does. 4 of those for the straight bits. And finally, the power connecting clip, which connects the transformer to the track.
After 7 hours and 42 minutes of carefree reassembling, I can feel the approach of that bittersweet moment. Sweet because hopefully my toils will have been productive and the train set will run. Yet bitter because I know that assembling the track will bring the process of reassembling to a close. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
There are many important questions being asked in the world today, but few as important as this. Will it run? More to the point, will it chuff, realistically? Let's find out. I hope all your toys reassemble as well as mine did. Today I am going to assemble a chocolate cake, and the ingredients are milk, flour, sugar, butter, cocoa powder, capacitor, choke resistor, single phase AC electric motor, planetary gear, intermediate and penultimate gears, pinions, shim washers, aluminium die castings, a light dusting of screws and washers, and 2 eggs. These are the 235 components of a Kenwood Chef A701A food mixer, a literal revolution, hundreds of them per minute, in fact, in domestic cooking. And I'm going to put them back together. And we're going to start with the electric motor, since that is what separates this from the pestle and mortar.
So I'll need the armature, a fan, some coils, the casing, a couple of brush holders and brushes, and 3 wavy washers.
That should keep me going until you turn over to a soap. Now, you are going to have to bear with me a bit on this one, because when the office said, what sort of food mixer would you like to reassemble, I said, what's a food mixer? It's completely uncharted territory, although it does contain some things that I know about. Electric motors, bit of soldering, I imagine. Screws, washers, you know, all that stuff. As a younger man, I used to think, wouldn't it be funny if there was actually somebody in the world who was called Ken Wood, which wouldn't be an uncommon name, and he happened to be a chef, so he became Ken Wood, chef. But it turns out that Ken Wood, I thought it was Sir Alexander Kenwood, but it's not. He was called Ken Wood, so he named his company Ken Wood. I think he also had a boat that he named Ken Wood. I've never made a cake before. I've never really done any baking. I'm not much of a cook, to be honest. I can do sort of, you know, shepherd's pie, cottage pie, chicken and ham pie, leek and potato pie. The brush holders are connected. If you look at this, I can't help noticing, this is a piece of the motor which is deep in the bowels of the mixing experience, but it does appear to have a bit of old cake on it. It's disgusting, but it could be from the 70s. I think this machine is from about 1971, 1972, so that could be the birthday cake of someone who's an old man or woman by now. It's covered in cake. Look at it. It's caked with cake.
The basic idea of an electric motor is very simple. You put electricity in one end and it rotates the shaft at the other. And that's it. You can then take the shaft and attach it to whatever you like. And once I've finished constructing this motor, I'll connect ours to the paddle, which will mix our chocolate cake mix.
I haven't delved into the bowels of very many domestic electrical appliances from this or any era. I would say this is a huge electric motor. Oh yes, that feels rather good. That's a fantastic invention. Imagine all the things that would be incredibly tedious, hard work. We'd have no power tools, we'd have no electric cars, no electric trains, no battery-operated sex toys. They'd all be clockwork. Imagine that if you had to stop and wind it up. I'm afraid it's wound down, madam. Or sir. I mean, I'm not...
Thankfully, this is not clockwork, but an electric motor, and it's starting to look like one.
Good. Let's just check that it still spins, and it does. There you go. Single-phase AC electric motor. A rather massive thing, isn't it? But it's quite nice. Best motor they ever made, that. That lasts for 1,000 years. We need to put these rubber grommets in because that's... It somehow mounts through those, although I haven't quite worked out how yet, but I can hear you screaming, poke it with the screwdriver. Yes, but I'm trying not to. It's an excellent opportunity for stabbing yourself with a screwdriver. So there's still a bit more of electric motor to do, which involves a bit more casing, that bit, plus we need 2 more washers and 2 more screws. That'll probably do for now because well, this will take me a while.
It did take a while, but 1 hour and 7 minutes after I began, the motor is almost assembled and the casing in place. Now I can attach the fan, which also helps regulate the speed of the motor.
This screwdriver is one of the most fantastic things I've ever owned. I know that suggests I've had a very sad life, and maybe I have, but you shouldn't mock the afflicted. The rule amongst people who use tools professionally is that you don't buy them until you absolutely need them. And that makes sense if it's how you make your living, because obviously you diminish your living if you're spending it all on tools. If you just buy tools because you're a bit of a pervert like me, then you can invent excuses for having them. Now, this is secured with a grub screw. It's going in with an Allen key, and it's going to be an imperial size, I'm guessing, as this is British and quite old, but I have a set. Magically, the imperial system harks back to, in many cases, divisions of the human body. So the foot was a foot, the inch, I think, was originally the end of somebody's thumb, and so on and so on. The metric system is, in essence, divisible by 10. The imperial system, its advocates would argue, is great because it's divisible by more numbers. So if you had a shilling, it's quite easy to divide into 2 people's worth of money, or 3 people's, or 4 people's. One of the things I do like about the imperial system is that it's more conversational, if you like. A lot of the units are more easy to relate to. You can say, oh, it missed it by half an inch. You know, you can't really miss something by 12 and a bit millimetres. The imperial system is almost dead, really, for most things. I'll close the lid on the imperial system and put it gently to rest on top of the small metric spanners. Right. I'm now just going to sit here and drink my cup of tea for a while, because every other one I've had in this series has gone cold. This is metric tea. The thing to remember about the great debate between metric and imperial units is they don't actually change the amount of beer or the lengths of footpaths or the heights of aeroplane above the earth. It's just a different way of expressing it. They're just units. They're just a means of understanding. You could measure them in lengths of Richard Hammond if you wanted to. The aeroplane is 28,000 Richard Hammonds above the earth. As long as we agreed on what a Richard Hammond was, it doesn't matter. It means the same thing. Then you could convert that to meters or feet or furlongs or things to do with the frequency of light. Doesn't matter.
Next up is the speed control unit of my food mixer. For this, I'll need a switch, a couple of retaining screws, a mounting plate, and a capacitor.
That's capacitor. I'll blow my head off later. That's it. Holy moly, look at all this. There's going to be some soldering in a minute. I hate soldering. Do you know what? Looking at this thing, I am quite curious to use one. There's a great advert that says, I mean, I hardly dare repeat it for fear of getting my balls kicked off by the sisterhood. I'm not saying this, I'm quoting the advert, okay, which is from the 60s, I believe. And it says something like, the Kenwood chef does everything except the cooking. That's what wives are for. But just to reiterate, I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying I agree with it. I don't agree with it. I'm merely quoting it. It's a historical document. I can also tell you some things that Hitler said. It doesn't mean I'm a Nazi. It just means I happen to know what he said.
Now I can clip these bits together and attach the capacitor.
It's sort of like a little temporary battery. It stores a bit of electricity and then releases it when you need it. That's a fairly reasonable definition of a capacitor. That's why they're a bit dangerous to muck about with, because you can think you've turned something off, and you have, and there's no electricity going into it, but there's some electricity hiding in it. It's like a little electrical booby trap. Get in, you horrible metal. I think we may be approaching the inevitable hour, which is what Thomas Gray might have been talking about had he gone to an electronic workshop rather than a country churchyard. We're going to have to do some soldering. Right. Plug in the soldering iron. God. Now, it takes about 5 minutes for that to warm up. I'm appealing to the editors of this programme not to cut around this, because it will probably be the first time in television history that a soldering iron has been seen to warm up in real time, and why should we deny that that happens? The people who produce this show think I'm stupid and that I don't realise what they're doing. I'm so familiar with their editing techniques. The Rachmaninoff starts in my head as I'm doing certain things. I know it's there. I'm not going to let you edit round this. If you're one of those amateur electronics enthusiasts, or even a professional electrical engineering type person, this is the point where you go on to Twitter and complain about my soldering. So just do it now. I'll do it for you if you want. You need to say something like, I didn't think much of James May's soldering, and why did he dip the end of the iron in the flux? Ha! Now get out of this one. It's not on at the wall. I can put off soldering in so many ways. I've just had a thought. I've been dying to try this out. I've been given this. This is a gift, and I suspect it's been given to me with the intention of making me look like a total knob. But what it is, it's a head-mounted magnifying system. So you get a selection of lenses. You need to put your glasses on to read the thing that tells you what size the lenses are. 2.5. I'm going to try 2.5. So I can't see a thing over there, but if I look down there, wow, that's amazing. There's a light on it, isn't there, somewhere? How do you switch that on? Is that? Yeah, look. How cool do I look? If I wear it down the pub, will I score, do you think? I can't work out where the cup of tea is. But
This is not only about looking good, it's also about accurate soldering of capacitor to speed controller plate.
that's brilliant. Look at that's the best soldered joint I've ever done. OK, now let's try glasses and the magnifier. It's massive. I can read tiny writing and all sorts of things.
The next piece to go on is the on-off switch, and this is an excuse to use my favourite screwdriver.
It holds the screw. It doesn't hold the washer, unfortunately. Bugger. Everything in the world is somewhere. As the findologists like to say, it's not lost, you are. Ah. Washers have several functions. They spread the load, thus protecting delicate materials and finishes. They also help to lock screws in place. If you have spring washers, for example, or wavy washers, you also use washers as shims to pack things up, things that don't line up correctly.
After a jaunty 4 hours and 23 minutes, I've built the AC motor and added the fan and the on-off switch. I've also reassembled the speed control board and attached it to the motor. So, I can move on.
Now, as the motor is, it is just a motor with a rotating shaft. It needs to transfer all that drive to the gearbox and everything else. So that requires a belt system, a toothed belt. We don't need the belt yet, but we do need the belt pulley, that little retaining ring. These 4 screws. So this is the drive belt pulley, which mounts on the other end of the motor with a roll pin, which is going to be slightly tricky because you would normally have a sort of roll pin squeezer to do this, which I don't have, so we'll improvise slightly. The first Kenwood Chef was launched in 1950. Eye appeal is buy appeal, said Ken Wood himself. He recognised quite early on, actually, that attractive domestic appliances would sell better than ugly ones. And we still see that today, don't we, with sort of designer fridges and those trendy Italian tin openers and lemon squeezers and what have you. And the first one sold out within a week from Harrods. It was probably considered quite a posh thing, because I think in today's money it cost the equivalent of something like £600. I think that is lined up. Let's try squeezing it with pliers, even though my instincts tell me that's not quite right. Oh, there you go, that's bloody perfect. That is the entire electric motor, the belt pulley and the speed control unit and the connection to the mains complete. And more joyously, we can move on to something that I like and understand, the gearbox. News has just reached me from the sadists who put this programme together that I haven't finished the electric motor. There are some other bits, so we'll do that again. Well, that's the electric motor almost finished, just a few more bits to put on.
I can joyously head back to the table to get the final bits of the motor. I can then blissfully attach the knob and Ken's name badge to finally complete the AC electric motor.
It looks like some sort of weird satellite from an old sci-fi film, doesn't it? You can imagine that floating around in space with some theremin music. The point about the food mix, though, I suppose, is, I mean, I'm all in favour of old technology being discarded because new technology is better. That's part of progress. We mustn't be held back by trying to hang on to things because they made them properly in the olden days. But the point about a food mixer is, regardless of what's going on inside the box, what it actually does is very simple. It provides a number of rotating shafts to drive appliances, and it has a whiskey thing that goes around in a bowl. That basic principle has probably been around since the Egyptians. Something has to go around in a bowl to stir things up. This has merely mechanised the process. So, on the basis that it's quite difficult to improve on the idea of a basic food mixer, we may as well stick with this one. That is the motor and the controls and the knob and the connectors all definitely finished, and we can move on to something that I'm much happier with, the gearbox. I'm looking forward to this bit. There's no soldering in it, for one thing. Right, now I'm going to remove from the table everything in this line here, which is the gearbox, and I like the idea of the gearbox because I understand gears. They can be considered levers in circular form. And they're important if you ride a bicycle, drive a car, have a food mixer, play spirograph, all sorts of things. Look at that lovely thing. I know that's going to feel nice with some grease on it somewhere. Oh, likewise that. Nice little pinion. Hours of fun. Hours. What I find interesting about gears is this shape on the teeth. That's taken a long time for humankind to arrive at a shape that meshes like that. It's extremely complicated, actually, if you analyse it right down to the Euclidean details. That's sort of the legacy of many, many centuries of refinement and thought in geometry, metalworking, arithmetic. Amazing. Anyway, how does it go together? Let's find out. Right, I don't know how this goes, but it ought to be possible to work it out because it's a gearbox. This bit, I'm guessing, given that that has an annular gear, is an epicyclic of some sort, because I know when the food mixer goes round and round, it goes round whilst going round. It is epicyclic. It is something going round inside something that is in itself going round. So I imagine there will be some planetary wheels inside there and some sort of sun arrangement. I'm fairly confident that that goes in there. Let me just work out how it all goes together. The epicyclic movement, I think we can probably already see it. You see that's the driver for the big K-shaped food mixer. That is going round inside something that is in itself going round. And that is possible because, I'm going to have to pull it apart again, aren't I? The whole thing is being rotated by that shaft, which has a flat on it, which locates in there, so that that's always in the same position relative to that shaft. But the end of the holder for the K is on a gear wheel, which is running in that annular gear wheel there. So it goes round while going round. Is that clear? It's a little bit confusing. If you play with spirograph a lot, it'll be a bit more easy to grasp. That runs in a nice bush. I'm still going to put a slight smear of grease on it. We'll make this the greasing finger. Oh, look at that going down. I'm wondering if this is as interesting to watch on television as it is for me to do, because when you sit down at the bench with that pile of bits, you think, oh God, how am I going to work this out? But then once you start doing it, it's a bit like a sort of chess problem or something. You know there must be an answer, and you just have to work it out. And I believe I've gone some way to working it out, so I'm feeling incredibly pleased with myself. Now look, you all want me to say something about how I love using lubricant or something like that. I know you do, and then you can tweet about it and go, oh, he said, you know, but so I'm not going to. Having said that, lubrication is incredibly important. If things aren't to wear out, overheat, be destroyed by friction. The interesting thing about oil and grease, the oil in the engine of your car, for example, because the oil is there, no two metal parts actually touch each other. They're separated by oil, and the layer of oil could be a molecule thick even. But if you take the engine of a car, it will last for, what, 200,000 miles? That's not unusual. If you ran it without any oil in it, it would probably last maybe a minute. That's how important oil is. What it is making me think, actually, as I do this, is how difficult, sophisticated cooking are you making all those cake mixes and batter and whatever else must have been before machines like this were available. I mean, it must have just taken, like laundry, I suppose, before washing machines were created. It would have just taken days and days of work. I mean, for some people in big posh houses, I suppose it was actually a living doing these things. Well, here's the thing. This is what bothers me. Labour saving. It started with things like this. So cooking becomes easier, mowing the lawn becomes easier, getting about becomes easier because we have bicycles and motorcycles and cars and so on. And then we had the digital revolution. And then the microprocessor and the computer meant that we could work out fantastically complicated things and produce charts and diagrams and drawings that would have taken days or weeks to do on a drawing board or with a piece of paper and a pen, and there's all this time that's been saved by all these things, but where's it gone? By rights, we should all be sitting at home learning to paint or play the violin or philosophizing or something, but we're not. We're still running around like idiots, tending to the very machines that were supposed to save us. Where is all this time we were promised? Where is the leisure society? It's full of people having heart attacks. Time-saving devices free up time to spend with other time-saving devices, like video games or reassembling things, which worked perfectly well before somebody took them apart.
In the interest of reassembling this previously perfectly good thing, I just need to apply some silicon sealant. Then I can fit the two halves together.
That is together. You can tell that is together because the silicon is evenly squeezed out all round. We can go ahead and put the screws in though. But what a pleasing thing that is, isn't it? And it's more pleasing for knowing what's going on inside it. You've seen all those inner workings, or those mysterious bits that most people never see and never even imagine. What you see is just a paddle going around and around and around, stirring up cake mixture. It's sort of fairly boring, really. But once you've seen it in its nakedness, disassembled, and you've had to put it back together, you know what's actually going on. You'll never look at one of these in the same way again. You'll say, ah, yes, that's going to be some chocolate brownies, thanks to a planetary gear system. I'll have a tiny little bit of goo on that shaft, just out of politeness. That goes on there. This is the little clever dog clutch bit. The end of the shaft with the pinion on that drives the gearbox is threaded. So this is a dog clutch. It's a clutch that engages not progressively like the multiplate clutch of a car, say. This has simply got flat bits which go clunk onto other flat bits. It's nice, isn't it? Right, there's the flat on there, there's the flat in the epicyclic hub. That is a nylon washer. That is the securing nut, which will have to be nipped up. I thought that was 5/8, it's not quite, but anyway. That's the main gearboxy bit of it done. I enjoyed that. Mechanisms. They're nice. Super.
In the mere blink of an eye, which just happened to last for 7 hours and 1 minute, I've rebuilt not only the motor, but also the gearbox, which I now have to fill with grease to ensure that all those moving parts remain lubricated for the next 50 years.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15. Could be a new form of aerobics. It's a handy little blob of grease which will keep, could be useful. That's tragic, isn't it? I mean, people save screws and things, but actually saving blobs of grease. That's a useful blob of grease. Keep it in an old cornflakes box. Right, that is the gearbox and the motor complete. They are quite esoteric, really. We can now move on to bits that start to make it look like something you'd expect to find in your kitchen. Namely, the pedestal, as it's called, the sort of chassis of the thing. Evil-looking spring, look at that. The motor housing. And these bits. Follow me. Something that people don't realise about these food mixers, if you look underneath there, that is open. The point of the feet is to elevate it slightly above the worktop of your kitchen. It allows air to circulate. The motors of these things and the control units get very hot. So if you don't have the rubber feet on, the air won't get in, it will overheat, burn out, and then you'll have to have, well, somebody will have to do to yours what I'm doing to this one now, i.e. take it to bits and put it back together again. The feet, I've looked this up, cost about £3 for a set. They wear out, people don't bother to replace them, they ruin the whole machine. Now, this next bit, I'm advised, can be a bit tricky. This is the little arm that stops the whole thing falling apart completely when you open it up. I'm sure it has a name, I don't know what it is. That will go through there, through the spring. And you have to keep the spring out of the way while that goes on. Piece of cake. Don't know what all the fuss was about. Now watch as this becomes even more of a Kenwood mixer. And I think a gentle tap. That is an interference fit. There is a tube to go inside it. So that would go like so. And then the pin would feed through from that side until that groove for the circlip appears on the other side, which I think it just did. I am now going to mount the motor assembly, which is pretty much complete, but we need a few other bits. And they are this orangey bit. That is the motor shroud. We need these screws and lock nuts. Okay, now this isolates the motor from the rest of the mount. So let's then it can only go one way round because the knob goes through the hole. Now, that is the motor shroud, which goes over there, but before that can go over there, that bar has got to come, the strut has got to come up and locate onto there, so you drop that in there first and release that and bring that up and attach that to that. Then we can slide the cowling up and screw it into position. I think that we may have arrived at an important moment. That is quite pleasing. It's a hell of a spring in there. Now, I do believe we can put the gearbox assembly onto there. Now, that really does look like a food mixer then, doesn't it? Without taking a modern food mixer apart, I don't really know how different it would be from this one. I mean, the mechanical aspects of it, I imagine, would be exactly the same, because gears are gears. I mean, the thing is, we have this idea that stuff in the past lasted a long time, but that's because we can only see the stuff that's lasted a long time. We forget about all the stuff that we threw away because it was rubbish. So it could be that in the 70s, food mixers were built to last a long time, and it might be that today kitchen knives are being made of steel that will sharpen forever and last a very long time, so that another generation can say, oh, this isn't made properly, not like it was in the good old days. Look at my old kitchen knife. I've had that for 50 years. Yes, you have, but everything else you had 50 years ago is long gone to landfill because it was rubbish. Most of us only really know what happened based on what we can see. So therefore, medieval England was just full of cathedrals. Must have been amazing. It could be that the thing that survives is the reassembler. And if that's all that archaeologists can find in 50,000 years' time, they'll say it was a strange age of man when people put things together. We're not sure what these things were. One of them was a food mixer. Lasted 50 years, you know. They don't make them like they used to. Let's go and get a few more pieces. It's very, very close now to being complete.
I'm going to need the belt to transfer the drive from the motor to the gearbox. This plate,
And that's it. Right. That is a toothed belt. That is a bit like the final drive of a large Harley-Davidson. That's looking quite good, but what is vital is that when this piece is on the top, the motor is exactly central, so that that drive piece, which is for one of the attachments, doesn't rub against it. That's pretty good. I'd love to be able to cook properly. I imagine it can't be entirely impossible to learn, because a huge number of people in the world can cook. Well, that makes a good comedy noise, doesn't it? That goes on top, thus, I had never thought until now very carefully about what actually went on inside a food mixer. If you'd asked me, I'd have said, well, there must be some gears of some sort, and there must be an electric motor, but I wouldn't have known. And it's all rather tragically hidden, actually. What a pity you can't see it. What if they made all of this transparent so that you could watch all the gears going round and round? That would be fantastic. See, the Victorians, because they were so very excited about the things they'd achieved with cast iron and so on, they put it all on display in places like Kew Gardens and King's Cross Station. They wanted you to see it and marvel at it. But then later on we decided that you shouldn't see how things worked, apart from a brief period in the 90s where see-through computers were quite fashionable. And then we got to the point where we decided you shouldn't see how things go together. So quite a lot of things like smartphones and tablets, although if you look very, very carefully, you can see some very, very tiny screws on them. On the whole, you're supposed to look at it as a sort of organic whole, as if it sprang from the earth, as an entity. They don't want you to see that it went together. They do the same in the interiors of cars. You used to see screws and fixtures all over them, but now they're just a wall of stuff, and you think, well, how did that go together? The answer is that a lot of it clips together. The clips have become quite sophisticated and quite difficult to dismantle. Not that you should really want to take your car apart, that really is a fool's errand. Turn this upside down. Now I have an excuse, at least on these front screws, to use one of my favourite screwdrivers, which is this long Phillips one. It's nice. I normally think of it as a carburettor screwdriver. It's good for reaching deep into the bowels of something big. So I'll have to find a stubby, or at least a little one. There. I am genuinely now, having been slightly ambivalent about the food mixer when we started, I'm genuinely excited to see it going round and round. That's so close. Almost there.
This time I need to get the bits to attach the flex.
Close machine. Invert machine. Now, do I know what I'm actually doing here? Let's have a think. Yes, that is the flex, as I still quite like to call it, because I like the word flex. Oh, get in, you. The washer's supposed to go over the cable, and it always ends up underneath it. It's a sort of sod's law of wiring things up. Brown is live, blue is not. Green and yellow, earth the lot. That maxim's rubbish, because you can say it exactly the wrong way and it still works, doesn't it? Red is live, green is not, blue and brown, yeah. And now the crowd goes quiet as the flex is thread through the hole at the back of the Kenwood mixer. So that cable is twice clamped just in the back of the machine, because of course it will also be clamped in the plug. You could probably swing from a suspension bridge by this machine and you'd be absolutely fine. That's so satisfying. Nice big clunky noises. That's a big clunky noise. Oh, give us a break, come on. The production have actually dismantled the plug. I mean, that wasn't really necessary. People know what a plug's like. Tonight on the Reassembler, something you've done yourself 1,000,000 times. Might as well do tying shoelaces if we're going to do plugs. Did you know, before the establishment of the idea of a national grid, which was in, I think it began in either 1923 or 1927, I can't remember, but there was something like 21 different plugs and sockets in London. Because all electricity was generated locally, there were very few appliances, and the people who generated the electricity often provided the appliances or made them and sold them. So they just invented, you know, round pin, square pin, 3-pin, 1-pin, whatever. And they've never been standardised across the world, but then things like the voltages and the frequencies haven't been standardised across the world either. So it's perhaps not surprising. We are moving on to parts of the machine now that help really to cement its identity. The identity being the work of Sir Kenneth Grange, the designer, who did not only this, but things like the Kodak Instamatic. I think he did a radio. Most famously, he did the Intercity 125 train, the shape of it, and the cab, I believe. And that was a fantastic looking thing. And this is what the future looked like when this was designed. It was quite minimalist. They, lost the curviness that you would associate with the 1950s, and we'd gone to this rather squarer form that you would eventually come to associate with most of the 1970s. That goes in there. The most important thing to remember about Sir Kenneth Grange was that he was called Ken. You weren't really allowed to work for Ken Wood unless you were also called Ken, because that would have meant renaming a lot of things, his house, his boat, his haircut, the lot. Put the handle on, like so, and then put that on top of there, like that. Fantastic. All that is left now is to put that piece of foam rubber in the bottom of there, and then that piece in there for the bowl to sit on. That is fantastic, isn't it? Look at that. You would never guess, looking at that rather simplistic, minimalist shape, just what is going on inside that thing. That motor, that gearbox, all those hundreds of screws and little bits and pieces, and the release lever, epicyclic arrangement. It's all fantastic, isn't it? There it is, the Ken Wood Chef. Let's arrange it artfully for you there.
Now for the penultimate visit to the table, where I can finally get the mixing paddle, which is shaped like a K, for Ken.
I'm guessing that goes into there, and then you lock it in position with a little nip on that. I've never done this. How does this go in? Now, of the 235 pieces that we started with, there is one left to put on. Can you guess what it is? Without it, the machine is useless, or extremely messy and dangerous. At any rate, it's this. It's the bowl. Look, the mixing bowl. What a wonderful thing. We are going to make a cake.
My 1960s food mixer is nearly complete. The last 9 hours and 32 minutes have been so enjoyable that I think in future I may take apart and reassemble all my kitchen appliances before I use them. I'll see if this one works first, though.
Let's begin with the all-important cocoa powder. All I have to do, remember, in the modern world is chuck it in the bowl. Sugar and flour in equal amounts. Butter and milk. Two eggies. Fantastic. There you are. The motor, the speed controller, the gearbox, the K-paddle, the bowl, the chassis. Most importantly, the ingredients for a cake. Does it work? It has to work, otherwise it's just going to be a mess. To the memory of Kenneth Wood. Yes! Ha-ha! Look at that, it really works. Let's find a baking tray and warm up the oven. The Japanese famously can make anything smaller than the rest of the world thought possible. Cameras, radios, hotel rooms and trees. And as it turns out, motorcycles. This is a Honda Z50 Mini Trail monkey bike, just about the least motorcycle you can get away with. And it's presented here in 303 component parts and is frankly taking up far too much space. So let's put it back together. Right, we'll begin with the frame and the front forks, because once we've got those together, the thing will stand up on the bench.
As well as those two bits of ironmongery, I'll also be needing some tiny ball bearings. How many, I wonder?
Now, if you were doing this like a professional, you'd look in a parts book to see how many balls go either side of the forks. But as it's come apart recently, and I know the number is correct, all we have to do is divide the number of balls in this dish into 2. So let's see how many there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44. Did I count those two? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. That would mean 21 per side. Anybody still watching?
Assuming you are, I'll get on with putting the bearings in the greased headset, and then we can crack on.
So there was a whole range of these bikes made by Honda with 50, 70 and 90cc engines, and they were available as the Mini Trail. There were some other versions which didn't have a fuel tank. Those were given various names, and they were given different names in America from the rest of the world because certain names that Honda used, like Cub and Super Cub, had already been taken by other people. And it's mainly because American lawyers are quite aggressive about pursuing that sort of thing. Whereas really they should spend more time inventing some new types of cheese. Because as we know, the Americans only really have one type of cheese, which is called cheese. They say, "You want cheese with that?" I say, "Oh yes, what sort of cheese have you got?" "It's goddamn cheese, you communist," you know. This is my case of tools. Look at this. Are you ready? Oh. I'd put the sockets back in the box in the wrong order. I'll have to be killed.
After locating the correct socket, I can tighten these bolts, and that's the forks done.
So let's do the front wheel. Or should we put the rear swing arm on next? Any views? Swing arm, wheel, swing arm. Let's do the swing arm. Then we've got a complete frame. Plastic tub. Now, there really aren't very many bits for this, and only one of them actually fits in my plastic tub. Now, as you can see, this component is quite dirty, but as we've said all along, we're not restoring things here. We're not even cleaning them up. We are simply putting them back together. We can clean that off later if we feel a bit neurotic about it, which I probably will. I'm going to have a bit of grease in here because it's an important pivot. It does a lot of work. If I grease that one that side and that one that side, the bolt will push the grease into position as it goes through. Are you ready for this enormously important moment? That's a nice close fit on there, which suggests that this isn't horribly worn out, which is nice. It's still got the original sticker on there, look, from 1976, warning you not to interfere with the motorcycle. Modifications will affect tuning and decrease performance. Rubbish. Everybody knows you put a bigger exhaust and noisier exhaust pipe on your monkey bike. It sounds faster, therefore it is. Right, here we go. You see the end of the nut? It's got those slots in it. They mean it grips the threaded shaft. It's like a sort of nylock, but a slightly more sophisticated version because this is a very important application. So we get to about there, and I will go to there. And we like it. I like it.
I like it so much that I'm going to slow things down a bit now with the front brake.
So those are brake shoes, obviously, with brake shoe material on them. Some irritating little springs, a screw, or is it a bolt, has a captive nut device on the other end. And then we need the thing it runs in, which is the brake hub. We'll put it on the wheel in a minute. Brakes these days are massively better. They're mainly, apart from very small bikes, they're hydraulic, they're discs, they're vented discs. The material of the pads is much better. I mean, the brakes are better than the tyres in the modern world, so if you brake hard enough, you will lock up the wheel if you haven't got ABS, and the tyre will skid, whereas in the old days, that was virtually impossible. The brakes were never good enough to overcome the tyre, even though the tyres were terrible back then as well. I think one of the reasons motorcycles have a bad reputation as being dangerous is not because they are inherently dangerous in themselves, it's because they didn't stop until about, once you got into the 80s, they began to stop a bit. By the 90s, they were good. And modern bikes, they just, you can almost do somersaults on them. Now, the death of the British motorcycle industry, that is a very big and complicated subject, but a lesson not just for manufacturing industry, but a lesson for life, for everybody, in all walks of it. Up until the 60s, the British motorcycle industry dominated the world. And when the Japanese came along, making things like mundane bikes, really, ride-to-work bikes, as they're often known, the British, and to some extent the Americans, and even the Germans and the Italians, took the attitude that, well, the Japanese, you know, ha ha ha, funny little foreigners, they'll make cheap bikes for people to ride to work on, but the really important bikes, the ones that people desire and where the money will be made, they will be made by us because we know what we're doing. And the mistake they made was imagining that people like Soichiro Honda and the people at Kawasaki and Yamaha and so on wouldn't say, well, we'll have a go at a big bike as well. And of course Honda did, and everybody was surprised, thinking, well, that's not allowed. But it was allowed. And what we should learn from that is, A, not to be rude about foreigners, because they can do stuff as well. And secondly, it's no good thinking that you will rule the world by making high-end, high-added value things for executives and playboys. All the great car and bike manufacturers of the world are founded on small things for the people. VW, Skoda, Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, Fiat. They made small, simple, cheap things that were accessible to a lot of people, and that gave them their money, their expertise to then branch out and, in the case of Fiat, eventually own Ferrari. In the case of Honda, to eventually become the world's biggest manufacturer of internal combustion engines and producer of the Honda Super Cub, the best-selling machine in history. That's what you get by being humble. Now, the tricky bit here is something we talked about in the last series, springs. Evil things, very useful, but very evil in the workshop because they cause things to fly across the room, hit you in the face. Look. Shoe goes there, other shoe, avoiding touching it with my slightly greasy fingers, goes there. That spring has to go across there, between those two holes. Now, that's not a distance much bigger than the spring, but it is a very tough spring. I have got a bad finger, as you can see. I am very weak. I'm going to get a series of excuses in. Okay, I have to have the strength to pull that apart enough to get around the pivot. 3, 2, 1. So nearly had it then. Is it getting very hot in here, or is it just my acute embarrassment at not being able to reassemble the brakes of a tiny child's motorcycle? Are you ready? Right, so look, this is how it works. That is the drum, that is part of the wheel, that is going round and round. This is the brake assembly, that is part of the frame in effect, because it's anchored to the front forks. There's the wheel going round and round. Obviously it'll do it a lot more smoothly. You pull the brake, the shoes spread, the wheel stops. Okay? It's clever, isn't it?
After 2 hours and 21 minutes, an hour of which was spent trying to count to 42, I've beaten the drum brake into submission
So nearly had it then.
and attached the rear swing arm. Now I can pleasurably move into the realm of wheel attachment.
So the hub goes this side. You can see that it did because it's left a mark on the wheel. That's another witness mark. And I'll hold it up this way, make it easier. Let's make the holes line up. Actually, I find wheels a very baffling concept because it's obvious how they work, or is it just obvious because we're very familiar with them? What is actually happening when a wheel goes round and round? Because at the middle, the very centre, it's not really going round and round at all, is it? It's going more round and round the further you get to towards the edge. I know it sounds like a stupid question, but think about it for a minute, because the amount by which it goes round diminishes as you work towards the middle, and it must eventually get to naught. Or does it? I'm genuinely asking. I don't know. I stopped concentrating. Right, so these don't have to be particularly tight, these. And I think the correct torque setting, I know what it is, but we don't have a torque wrench here. It's a medium grunt, so it's about... There you go. We're going at the front mudguard and its fixings. So the mudguard itself, 2 screws, 2 nuts, and there are 4 washers, 2 spring and 2 plain. I'll explain why that is in a minute. I know you can't wait. So, washer on that side spreads the load. Then from underneath, we will have the spring washer, because that ensures that that nut can't come undone. And there it is. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, 10mm, there in its correct slot. Now, there's a long-running debate, particularly between me and one of my mates, Colin, about whether you should put the tools on the bench or back in the box. Now, if they're on the bench, they're to hand as you need them. If you put them back in the box, you know where they are when you need them. And the fact is that surgeons put everything back on the tray in the correct position after they've used it, so they don't sew a patient up with a scalpel or something inside them. That's my argument. His argument is that if I keep putting things back in the box, we'll never put the bike back together. It's sort of like a bad mechanic's marriage.
And the advantage of having all my tools in the right place is that I can do this.
What do you think of that? Right, we shall put the front wheel on. If we're lucky, I can get that to go in there. There you go. Now let's be absolutely clear. What you should not do here, because it's really bad workshop practice and it's an offence to good tool etiquette, is put a screwdriver through it. That's just wrong. That's about right for a front wheel nut on a small bike. Okay, now I think we will put on the... Let's put the rear spring damper units on first, then we'll assemble the brake for the back wheel and the back wheel itself, and then add those, and then we can strap it down, and it'll become exciting, because it'll be bike-like. Happy with that idea? We need the 2 spring and damper units, which are those. Oh, they're so small and light. There are 3 nuts involved, 6 washers, and that long bolt. That is definitely a bolt. The way this goes, put washer first, through the unit, another washer, so through, don't put it all the way through until you've lined it up with that. There you go. That will stand up. A washer, spring damper unit the correct way up, another washer there, a domed nut, like that. We can demonstrate that it works. That works. Rear wheel brake components. Oh God, this of course means I have to do the bit with the springs again, which I hate. There are the 2 springs. Right, this way for massive hilarity. Right, there's no getting away from it. It's time for that springy moment. Ready?
What's the problem, Jim?
Well, it's gone over the ship. Oh, dear, this is why the boiler suit should be... There you go, it's done.
I'll stop wearing the bike and carry on reassembling it. I'll need the rear mudguard.
So, mudguard itself. 4 of those. And 4 washers. We can have a discussion about what those are over here at the bench. Now, back to that eternal question, what is a bolt and what is a screw? What is that? Now, technically, for it to be a bolt, it should have a doweling function, i.e. a portion that isn't threaded, there to hold things in the right position and is secured with a nut. If it's threaded all the way up and it screws into a thread on another component, it is technically a screw. Now, these go into nuts, but they're nuts that are captive because they've been welded onto another component, so they're sort of going into another component. So what does that make that, a screw or a bolt? I think, apart from that I think it doesn't matter, I think it's a duality problem. It's like light. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? It depends on what you're trying to observe. I hate not being able to see. When I was young and people used to warn me about the dangers of playing on railways, riding bicycles without lights on, smoking behind the bike sheds, all that sort of thing. They used to say you'll get killed, you'll get a terrible disease, you think it can't happen to you, but it can. I did think it could happen to me. I always accepted that. I thought, well, you know, in the midst of life we are in death. It could be just around the corner, it could be in the next few minutes. I was quite happy with that idea. But I never imagined I would be old. It never even occurred to me. It was utterly unthinkable, and I still don't believe it. But here I am doing this. I've got a bad back. I can't see. The stain on my trousers, I'd like to point out, though, is actually a bit of pizza from lunchtime. It's not because I've also become incontinent. I'm only 53. Right, that's all good. Back wheel, brakes assembled. Just need the wheel and the hub. Let's go. Quite a few bits to get here. We've got the hub, the sprocket, back wheel, my mate Jason, who once helped me put together a Honda Super Cub, which is a slightly bigger bike than this, put the bolts in part of the rear wheel assembly in the wrong way round and didn't tell me, even though I suspect he'd noticed. And it wasn't until we had the whole thing together we realised the back wheel wouldn't actually go round because the ends of the bolts were sticking out too far and were fouling it, and we had to take the whole thing to bits again. This is why you should actually do this with the workshop manual, or at the very least the parts diagram, so you can see exploded views, so you know where everything goes and which way round it goes. Otherwise, you can make a mistake that isn't revealed until many, many hours later. The Daimler Maybach of 1885 is considered by historians to be the first motorcycle, although it should be pointed out that it's got 4 wheels. It's a sort of motorcycle with stabilisers on it. But I suppose on the basis that one wheel at the back was driven and it had handlebars, it is a motorcycle of sorts. The motorcycle didn't really come right until well into the 1970s at the very earliest. I mean, if you look at motorcycles from World War I era, it's not a bit of automotive history I know a great deal about, but they were terrible. Some of them didn't even have clutches. You had to sort of push them along to get them going, and you had to kill the engine to bring them to a stop. That, combined with the brakes being absolutely hopeless, was just lethal. I think the thing that's appealing about motorcycles, well, for me anyway, is that it's the nearest thing that a modern man has to the charger of the medieval knight, to the Arthurian quester of legend, because it's a very similar sort of experience. You put on armour and you ride off alone into the sunset or the sunrise or whatever to do some good deeds. And I think that maybe is why it appeals to us, that and getting flies in your teeth. And it's an interesting experience riding a bike compared with driving a car, because you do sit in a car. I mean, you react to what it does. You you tilt your head as you go around bends and you brace yourself more than you're conscious of doing, to be honest. But on a bike, and especially a small bike, and especially one as small as this, you are actually part of the sort of physics envelope of the whole thing and how it works. How you move relative to the seat, where you tilt your head, whether or not you're tense or relaxed. That makes a huge difference to the way the thing performs, how smoothly it will go through a series of bends. And that's part of the appeal as well. I think it's that you really are at one with the machine because you're part of it. Until the rider's sitting on the bike, the masses and the mass centralisation and all that sort of stuff isn't fully resolved yet. You don't get on the bike, you sort of, without wishing to sound a bit crude about it, you insert the bike in you. Right, here we go. Oh, that's so nice. I think from this side, it's good, isn't it? There's no denying that that is a motorcycle. It's not much of one, but it is one.
If I lash this securely to the bench, I can move on to the next part of my reassembly.
So there you go, that's strapped up, very secure. We're going to do a bit of wiring. We'll put the coil on for the ignition and the main wiring loom, which runs back to front to the lights and so on. It's a few bits. I'll take my plastic pot. Wiring. We're now entering the dark region of electricity. There's lots of theories about how it works. A lot of people will say, oh, it's like water in a pipe. And it is until you look at it a bit closely. And then it isn't. For example, water never blows your face off if you touch it in a funny way. Now, I know mainly from mere experience that the way this goes is that goes to the front, those go to the rear lights, that is an earthing tag, that joins to the ignition coil. So I think we should be able to pass that down through that grommet. In a weird way, I like doing the fiddly wiring bit because it's very satisfying the way it all works out and plugs together. But at the same time, I don't really like electricity, and I don't entirely believe in it. I think the electrical age has been sustained largely by faith and a desperate desire for it to work. We so want electricity to work in the same way that we desperately wanted things like the Buttoneer and the SodaStream machine. We wanted them to work, so we told ourselves that they did, but they didn't. If we stop believing in electricity, everything will just go and won't work anymore. I've ridden electric motorcycles and electric scooters. I'm all for electric propulsion. I mean, I think we've known since the beginning of the 20th century that electric motors are the sensible way to power vehicles and all sorts of other things, because electric motors are actually pretty simple. And the electric motor predates the internal combustion engine, don't forget, by a good 20 or 30 years or so. The only problem is storing electricity. It doesn't like to be stored. It's like an animal. It needs to be free. But also, I don't think we need to make a choice, or certainly we don't need to make a choice yet about are cars and bikes and everything else electric, or do they use fossil fuels? I think, you know, they can live together for a long, long time yet. And why not? I've got an electric car. But I've also got cars with petrol engines. I don't see that as a conflict. Glasses. You're going to ask me about electricity. I don't really get electricity. I only really understand mechanisms. You can develop an instinct for mechanisms and you can feel that they're working and you can feel how they're working. You can feel when you're overstressing them. You'll know this just from riding a bicycle with gears. You know when you're pushing it too hard or when you've got it under geared or when you're overloading something. You don't get that with electricity. It's working. You may be overloading something on it and then it just goes pop and it doesn't work. There's no real feedback with it. That's one of the things that bothers me slightly. I can't be at one with electricity. I'm just enslaved by it. I don't like it. It's rubbish, electricity. Better off without it. Right, let's put the engine in. We need just 2 bolts for this. Those are definitely bolts. The nuts and the spring washers and the engine itself, which you will notice is already assembled. This I shall explain. Now, if you're watching very closely at the beginning in the aerial shot of the table, you'll have spotted that the engine is already assembled. Why, you may be asking? Well, on the Reassembler, we've already put a single-cylinder engine together in the last series. Here are some highlights. What the hell is that? You want to see the piston go up and down? Brilliant, isn't it? Look at that. It's most of the machine.
In 8 hours and 34 minutes, or just under the time it takes to ride from Yeovil to Arbroath, I've reassembled most of the machine. I've made good progress with the frame and wheels, as well as the engine, chain and carburettor.
Right, now we're going to get everything to do with your feet. So that's the foot pegs, the kickstarter, the gear selector and the rear brake pedal. We'll do all that in one go. The kickstarter, that is the kickstarter, all the rear brake components, which is quite a lot of stuff. There's a spring, a clevis pin, the brake pedal itself, and then we have the foot pegs. Righto. I think we will put on the foot pegs first. It's not widely known that the monkey bike, which we think of as a bit of comedy transport for hipsters, hippies and other cool adults, actually started life as a piece of entertainment for children. The idea was that visitors to Soshiro Honda's theme park could have a go at riding the bikes because they were small, so kids could do it. It was actually a very cunning marketing ploy. What it meant was the first bike that kids fell in love with was a Honda. The trouble was that the monkey bike proved so popular as an idea that Honda realised they'd had to put it into sort of serious production and sell it to adults as well, especially adults in the States who loved the idea of a miniature motorcycle that they could ride off-road around their yards, their massive farms, whatever. And it was in America that Honda really secured the success that would lead to his massive empire, because not only did he sell a lot of bikes there, he changed the image of motorcycling with his Super Cub, because up until that point it had been seen as something that, you know, Marlon Brandon did, and mincing about in the Wild One. But once the Super Cub came along, it was shown to be something that sort of posh college kids and mothers would ride, and couples would ride, and that sort of thing. That's what they had. You meet the nicest people on a Honda, rather than some greasy biker. So Honda were already pretty popular for doing that. Then they brought this along, and it was a sort of fun toy bike.
Once I've finished tightening up the bolts, or are they screws? They're definitely bolts, I think, of the foot pedals, I can get the exhaust on.
Over here we've got two collets, the retaining nuts. There's another nut that holds the exhaust to the frame. Finisher, heat shield, and the actual exhaust itself. We can do all this from this side. It's going to be very exciting.
I should point out here that the word exciting in this context should be imagined as being surrounded by inverted commas. The truth is, exhausts can be a bit tricksy to fit, moving as they do through 2 or maybe even 3 planes. But it's worth it because then you get to put the nice chrome heat shield on top of it.
That makes it look a lot better. Let's stand back and have a little look at that with that shiny bit of finisher on. That looks suddenly very purposeful. Very off-roady, very trail bikey, high exhaust pipe so that it doesn't get bashed on things. That's the style. I think we should do the handlebars. That's quite interesting.
In fact, I'd go so far as to say that putting the handlebars on is positively thrilling, as that's when it starts to look really motorbikey.
Honda and the other Japanese makers in the 60s and 70s were very keen on the idea that things like cables and wiring should be hidden as much as possible, or at least arranged very neatly. And all credit to them, it does make things look nicer, but it makes them much more fiddly to reassemble because various wires and cables go inside handlebars and tubes and so on. So this is the throttle cable. We're going to have to make that go down the bar and then make it appear at this hole and then tease it out through there. Thank you. Behold, if I've got that right, And I have throttle moving, twist grip turning, cable moving. I'm going to put the rubber grip on. I don't see why I shouldn't. It's quite an exciting moment. They are. That's a nice feeling, and that's what it's about. A twist of the wrist, as Keith Code said. Here is a switch. This is the kill switch, i.e. the on-off switch for the bike. It's a safety precaution, really, so that if your motorcycle runs away out of control, or more importantly, especially as you would ride these off-road, if it falls over on the deck and is in gear and still running and trying to drag you down the gravel path, sandpaper your face off, you just flip that switch and everything stops. Voila, what do we think of that? Just whipped myself in the face with it, but apart from that, that will eventually be there. Should we do the other handlebar? Then we'll have a pair of bars. Does that sound plausible? Well, one of the all-time consuming schisms amongst people who spend a lot of time doing things in sheds. I'm not talking about people who work in industry so much as people who do this sort of thing out of sheer perversion. It's, should you drink tea or coffee? I find tea, it's more of an industrious drink. I think it's one of the reasons why Britain industrialised so quickly and effectively is because we drank tea. But also there's a simple fact that coffee can make you a bit jittery if you have too much of it. Which is why I suppose the French weren't going to invent the first steam engine, because all the Italians, because they had a coffee and they just sat down and shook. Whereas Thomas Newcomen had a cup of tea and thought, right, steam engine. The French don't make many bikes. They used to make quite a few. People like Peugeot made motorcycles. The Italians, obviously, they make Moto Guzzi and Aprilia and Ducati. The Germans make bikes, the Japanese make bikes, the Americans make bikes, the British still make bikes, and modern Triumphs are tremendous. American bikes are for the most part, are a different proposition because America is a different country for the same reason that their cars are very different from European ones. It all goes back to distance, the availability of materials and fuel and the cheapness thereof, the fact that you have to go a long way generally in America, whereas in Europe you tend to go relatively short distances. Also in Europe, the roads grew out of ancient tracks, I think, you know, from wandering pilgrims and shepherds and all that John Clare type stuff. Whereas America laid its road before it because it was a pioneering country, it was new, so they made them straight and long and broad. So European cars and bikes, they were small, they had to be efficient because materials were expensive and scarce. Fuel, you know, there'd been a lot of rationing because of wars and so on. So we end up with small, light, relatively low performance but sprightly things. America ends up with big, comfortable, mile-munching, extravagant things. I mean, you can see the same thing in food. America celebrates quantity of food with cheese on it. So an American will often say to you, "Are you still working on that?" when you're eating your supper. And there will be plenty of it. In Europe, we tend to celebrate flavour more and less of it. So, I mean, a lot of people in Britain, for example, would dismiss Harley-Davidson as crude. And in some ways they are. They're big, lumpy V-twins, and they're not particularly efficient as engines. They're not particularly modern. The bikes are big, the bikes are heavy. But what they forget is that the culture of motorcycle use is different in the States. The roads are different, the distances are different, the cost of running things is very different. I mean, neither way is right particularly, they are just appropriate to their environments. It's what fills the world with variety. There, that was a lot of effort because Soichiro Honda was obsessed with the idea that that should be neat and tidy. But he was right though, wasn't he? If that just went here and had some ties around it, it would look a bit scrappy. A number of spring washers and things to go on here because obviously these have to be very tightly secured. Otherwise, you'd be riding along and you'd find yourself still holding the handlebars, but the rest of the motorcycle would have disappeared. And just for one terrifying moment, you'd be going along like someone on a motorcycle, in the attitude of somebody on a motorcycle, but without the motorcycle. Imagine the terror. Wouldn't last long, I suppose. There is that. It's about 60 pound-feet. Should do it. So look, this is quite exciting. It's one of those moments where it becomes more motorcycly than it was just a couple of seconds ago. There's a bar. You know, some sports cars have removable steering wheels. Whenever I've driven a car like that, I've been going along something like an A road and I've often wondered, can I take the steering wheel off and put it back on again before I have a crash? I think one of the dangers with these is I'd be riding along, hand on the throttle, and then I'd think, I wonder if I could collapse that handlebar and get it back on again before I get to the next bend. And eventually I'd try it. But why wouldn't you? It's like being in a dark room with a tea cosy. You will put it on your head, won't you? Why wouldn't you? I think we'll put the front brake on because, as Ferdinand Porsche once said, nothing should be able to go faster than it can stop. So we need a lever, nut, spring for the other end, and the cable. Here we go. In some ways, I prefer it if I went more blind, then I'd just wear glasses all the time and I wouldn't spend half my life looking for them. So the lever, there's only one lever on this because it doesn't have a clutch, because it's centrifugal. The lever goes on there and it's retained with, now this is technically a bolt because it has a doweling function. It's not threaded up its entire length and it is secured with a nut. However, it also threads into the bar, which would make it a screw. So you see, it's a pointless debate. There's no point really getting bogged down in it.
In the spirit of not getting bogged down in things, I'll attach the other end of the brake cable.
Okay, there you go. There's a front brake. The motorcycle can stop.
I, however, am not going to stop. I've got a monkey bike and I'm going to reassemble it, whether you like it or not. I've been here for 12 hours and 90 minutes, and the night's starting to draw in. So let's do the lights.
Oh no, that's an interesting dilemma. That screw went under the side panel, but which technically I'm not allowed to touch. I can't touch it because I spoiled that lovely top shot which shows the bike gradually diminishing on this table and flourishing on the bench, and I can't blow it out that way because it's... I don't know what the rating of that bulb is, but I can tell you without even being able to read it that it's feeble in the extreme. So your tyres didn't grip the road, you couldn't stop, and you couldn't see what you were going to hit anyway because the lights were so pathetic. I mean, I'm amazed we stuck with it, really. The motorcycle as an idea. If you proposed it now, people would say, well, don't be such an idiot.
But stick with it they did. So I will. I'll attach the lights, then I can go back to the table and get the fuel tank.
I love yellow as a colour for cars and bikes. I think it's absolutely fantastic. I've got a yellow bike. I've had yellow cars. My first car was yellow. Maybe that's got something to do with it. Observe the transformation. Doesn't need to be tight, mounted on rubber, just enough to stop it wobbling about. There you go. Fantastic. It's a toy motorcycle, but it is a motorcycle. It's the real thing. Let's put the seat on. The much repaired seat. Look at that, it's half vinyl, half insulating tape. Gaffer tape. Seat in position. That's good. I love the bits of tape. That means it's been loved, actually, that means, because somebody rode it so much that it started to split, as they always do eventually, but bothered to mend it. I like that. That's part of its history. It's part of what makes this one, and not one of the other ones, since they're all essentially copies of a master monkey bike. That's the nature of mass production. But this one, over time and use, has become specifically this one. Fuel pipe. I'm now going to reduce the remaining part count by 50%. Done it. Part number 302 of 303. I bet this piece is laden with meaning if you're into finding meanings and things, because it links the tank, the home to the fuel of our dreams, petrol, which is useless by itself, of course. It's just an annoying, smelly liquid, but it joins it up with the carburettor, which is the entry point for it doing something useful, i.e. going into the cylinder and being burned so that you can ride along. The union is made. Fuel meets engine. We're ready to go, apart from that side panel. And you'll be amazed how tricky this is to fit. If you talk to people about reassembling things, they will always try and be funny and say, I put together a bicycle or whatever and had a part left over, and so do I. Look, there it is, but not for long. Are you ready? The final piece of the 303, and one of the trickiest to put on. Here it is, the side panel. It's like a kung fu move. Brilliant. Meaningless, though, if it doesn't work.
If there's a better way to spend 13 hours and 51 minutes, well, I'd like to hear about it. I feel as though together we've come on a journey. It may have been me assembling the forks and the brakes and the electrics and all that other stuff, but I couldn't have done it without you, viewers. We may have had some bumpy times along the way, but if this monkey bike works, I feel our relationship will be all the stronger for it.
It is quite small. It's also very humble, but it does represent complete liberty. 2 wheels, 1 piston. That's all you need. Well, that's all you need if it actually works. So let's find out. Throttle stop just engaging, fuel on, tiny bit of choke, carburettor settings I've done. Here we go. Deep joy. Now, does it idle? I believe it does. I think this calls for some sunglasses and some dry ice. There are 2 good reasons for reassembly. One is as a form of therapy, to exercise a part of the brain that may otherwise remain dormant, and to use hand tools, which were the first things to empower us as a human species. The other reason is to test the popular notion that the past was somehow wonderful. I mean, it certainly looks good because we look at it through rose-tinted spectacles. But what did it sound like? Well, when I finished reassembling the 195 parts of this portable record player, we will know. And we're going to start with the arm, which is over here. We will require this mysterious bracket, that bit, which looks very familiar, some wire, a spring, oh God, some things, another spring, alert, a pin, and the usual smattering of screws, roll pins, washers, and what have you. Here we go. Now, this particular dang set is the Bermuda and is described here on the leaflet as a record reproducer. How posh is that? And what's really interesting is it's from 1963, which is the year of my birth. So on this bench we have 3 arms from 1963, mine and this one. And unusually we actually have an exploded diagram. which is a rare luxury on the Reassembler. So, cripes, part number 10, bring height adjuster plate. Well, that's wrong for a start, because 10 is some sort of grub screw. What do they think 11 is? Tone arm, height adjuster plate. Rubbish.
Well, never mind, I know what the arm looks like. I've got one on my record player.
I still own my records, I still occasionally play them, but it's a right bore because you put a record on and you sit down on the beanbag and make yourself comfortable and then it's finished. You have to get up and put another one on. And apart from anything else, you spend so much time ministering to the mechanisms of your automatic record player that there was no chance of getting up to any hanky-panky or whatever it is your mum and dad were worried about. This was probably the most effective contraceptive of the 1960s. Unless you could manage it in the 3.5 minutes of a song. Mind you, as a teenager, that was an eternity, wasn't it? So, no, but see, the thing is, records are a fantastically fond memory because I would run home from school or run to the record shop with my birthday money, my £1.99 or whatever, and buy a record, and that was incredibly exciting, and they were wonderful things, but that's because I was 14 years old. Everything is exciting when you're 14 years old, and ice cream is, you know, meeting a girl, it's just all deliriously thrilling. Well, maybe it's still it. We'll find out in a minute. Anyway, I've done a bit. I've put that in, and that is the tone arm height adjustment plate.
The tone arm will hold a stylus, the point of contact between the recorded music and its electromagnetic reproduction, all of which represented a quantum leap in the consumption of popular music.
The great development when I was young was the cassette player, because you could buy a blank cassette, say a C90, 90 minutes, and then you could record your records and all your mates' records, and you could make a party mix, which was a godsend. But you couldn't do that like a download. You couldn't sit there and take 10 seconds to download a song. You had to do it in real time with your fingers on the buttons of the tape recorder and the records. You had to listen. You had to have the party by yourself before you could then have it again with your mates. And it was technically illegal. You know, people used to say home taping is killing music, but it didn't seem to be, as far as we were concerned, it seemed to be spreading it like wildfire, because we could all listen to it. Only one person had to actually buy the record. Everybody else could just steal it. It was brilliant. Right, so that clamp holds the pin. The pin is already through the slot. That pivots very smoothly. That's nice. You simply clip that in wherever on the spring you think is relevant. That's that. That's the arm. It's definitely a bit of a record player, isn't it? Tremendous. Now I think, having studied the diagram, that everything else I'm going to do will have to take place either side of the chassis, which is the big plate here. I want to mount the arm on this bit, which I'm going to call the tower. It's quite a nice component. I do need this complicated, riveted together little assembly. You can only take the portable record player as far as the extension lead would allow you, I suppose. But the great thing about it was that the early, sort of, my grandmother's era, record players, or gramophones as they were usually called, were pieces of furniture. They were like sideboards, and they tended to be in an important place in the home, such as the sitting room. And if you wanted to listen to a record, you had to sit there while your dad smoked a pipe and your mum did a tapestry or whatever, and that was just not very conducive to teenage revolution. You had to wait for your parents to go out. But once they made a portable record player, that means you could go and hide in your bedroom with it, or in the loft or the garage. You could carry it around to your mate's house. Before you knew it, you had punk rock, cars were on fire in Paris, and all the rest of it. It was fantastic.
So I'm going to attach the housing for the mechanism that detects which size of record is about to play.
History generally records that the teenager was a bit of a 60s invention. It didn't really exist until then. People went to school, and at the age of 14, they instantly turned into their parents. And things like transistor radios, portable record players, they were the beginnings of music on the move, I suppose. They're what led ultimately to things like, you know, smartphones with MP3 files, iPods, and all the rest of it. The CD player, the portable CD player, the Walkman cassette player, they all made music more and more accessible in more and more places and available ultimately on the move. So Yes, I suppose this could be seen as something of a revolutionary artefact. What I'm beginning to find quite remarkable about this is that, save for the electric motor and a few little bits in the speaker, which are electric, obviously, this is an entirely mechanical device, and yet quite a sophisticated and clever one. Like that. Oh, look at that. Springs. Before the record player, there were things like the phonograph, which was a cylinder record player, Thomas Edison and some other bloke. And prior to that, it was live. You had to either learn to play an instrument or you had to go to places where bands and minstrels and the London Underground, for example. That's why recorded music was such a marvellous thing. I mean, back in the day, this was an expensive piece of kit. I think in today's money, it would cost about the same as a really good smartphone, which I suppose is appropriate, except, of course, this only played up to 8 records. It didn't do any of those other things. So it was expensive. But actually things, despite what a lot of people tell you, things were expensive in the olden days. It's one of the reasons things had to be made repairable. It wasn't a moral thing. Things had to last because they were too expensive to replace. Because things had to last, in some ways, that arrested progress because there was less incentive to improve them. So although your smartphone might only last for, you know, a year and a half before you've sat on it and snapped it in half or dropped it down the bog or whatever, that actually isn't such a bad thing because the next one you get will be much better.
I'm 1 hour and 50 minutes into my reassembly. I've done the tone arm and attached the housing for the record size selector. Time for some more bits.
Anyway, the speed control knob, we've got all sorts of interesting things to say about that. Here's the mechanism from underneath, the little lever, screws, clips. And then this clever bit, which allows the machine to know what size record you've just put on it mechanically, and that is a little finisher bit for the top of the turret. Being from 1963, which was an excellent year, this record player is not only contemporaneous with me and my birth, it's also from the same year as the launch of the cassette tape. And the cassette tape, if I remember correctly, was originally devised as a means of improving dictation machines, because the bigger tape would have been much clearer than those tiny little ones that they use. But da kids got hold of the technology and decided, well, that's no good, it's much better for ripping off my mate's record collections. But that's often the way. You need the sort of the imagination of youth to see the true potential of these things. And the other thing we're going to do in this part of the process is fit the speed control, which has 16, 33, 45 and 78. Now, the first popular records were 78s. That's what my grandparents would have had, your great-grandparents possibly. And they lasted for, I think, about sort of 2.5, 3 minutes. And in fact, the automatic record dropping system was first devised for 78s, because if you had something like the movement of a Beethoven symphony, obviously it wouldn't fit on one 78. You had to have a number of them dropping down in succession. You still get gaps in the music, but you didn't actually have to do the stuff. The 45, which I think the first one was Bill Haley and the Comets. That was the first vinyl 45, and they lasted for sort of typically 2.5 to 3.5 minutes, depending on how they were cut. And the 45 sort of rose and decayed in popularity. That was a stupid word, wasn't it? What's the word I mean? Rose and diminished in popularity during the time that a record player like this was available. The 45 very quickly gave way to the album, because the album you would get lots of songs on, the 33 1/3 RPM record, which could be a good 20 minutes per side. The downside of all that is that the album-length record could be used for a series of great songs, such as the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, but it did give rise to the horrors of the concept album. So you could end up with something like King Crimson's Lizard, which just had one long song all the way across one side, rambling on about pixies and goblins and Prince Rupert and all that hippie nonsense. So, isn't it interesting that vinyl is actually a very long-lived format, because CDs have come and gone whilst we still have vinyl with us. In fact, vinyl sales are increasing again now because people like it for nostalgic reasons, because it gives warm sound, you can do scratching with it and so on. Unfortunately, the 33 1/3 RPM LP also gave rise to the concept album. So you'd get things like King Crimson's Lizard and Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. You get stuff, or Supper's Ready, you know, all that stuff that goes on for a whole side, and it's just complete drivel. A lot of old hippie nonsense about goblins and Prince Rupert and... God. Anyway, this drops in here. Use that little spring past there. Then we'll have a look at what's going on underneath. By the way, a bit of confusion, if you've been watching this very carefully. I said this was a Dansette Bermuda, which it is. The deck part of it, the turntable bit, says Monarch on it. That's because this was made by BSR, Birmingham Sound Reproducers, which is why they call it a record reproducer on there. This bit was brought in from then to the Dansette factory and fitted in Dansette's case and electrics and so on. So it's a Dansette unit with a Monarch turntable in it. The Dansette bit was based in London. This bit, the mechanical bit, was made in Birmingham. Same as Richard Hammond, except hopefully this will function properly at the end of it. So to have a, let's see what's going on underneath there. That's the other end of the bit we've just dropped in. This plate is connected through that pin to the arm. So the arm can go in 3 different positions, there, there, and there. And where that goes to is dictated by what hits that on the way down. That's the little thing that the record hits. You imagine you've got a record that big or that big or that big. As it goes down, it clouts that, and how much it clouts it and how far tells the mechanism underneath what size the record is and where to put the needle. It's brilliant, really. Now, speed control. The speed of record, 16, 33, 45, 78. A pleasure that we had as children that you young people don't have with MP3 players is you can't play music at the wrong speed, and we could. We could put anything that was supposed to be on a 45 on 78, and any song in the charts could be performed by Pinky and Perky. You can play them backwards and forwards, which is what scratching is. See, another abuse of a format leading to an art form. It's good, isn't it? This is the Dansette Bermuda. Quite an exotic name for the 60s. Prior to this, in the 50s, they made things like the major and the minor and the auto change or something like that. And then they decided to call one the Bermuda because people's horizons were broadening, because the people of Britain just became more worldly. Oh yeah, look, I didn't put that on. That, I'm told this is very easy to break, so... Isn't that nice? 1960s beige. Yeah, the 60s and the 70s especially, brown. Brown became very popular for kitchen units, cars, clothes. I think maybe as a sort of natural break on our optimism, because a lot of things seemed to be good in the 70s. We thought, oh, everything's becoming very modern and very funky, but actually it wasn't, because none of it worked and the lights kept going out. So it was probably a government initiative to stop us getting too carried away with the idea that everything was brilliant. It's not bad, but just so you don't, you know, build your hopes up too high, it's available in the following range of colours. Brown. That's well diddy, that screw. Magic screwdriver. Have you noticed how I've got a box full of screwdrivers that I'm very attached to, and I'm very keen to talk about them. I actually use 3. It's not true, actually, I use 4. Now, I'm going to show you how this works in a minute. I want to make sure it's together, otherwise it'll all fall apart in my hands. Speed control. You move the lever. Ooh, that's a nice noise. Love it. Used all the bits up as well. Let's do... hang on, there's some unfinished mechanical business on the bottom, I believe. So I think we'll get all those bits, and I don't think we need to put that bit in yet, but let's go and have a look at the components. Plastic pot. That. I need that with its little spring. These 4 bits which retain that and stop it flopping about. And then the other end of the mechanism is that lever. Hang on, let me just think about this for a minute, because I'm finding there's something slightly unconvincing about this arrangement. So that would go on there. That would also go on there. May you muppet. Goes in there. God above. Right, that's better. Now that can go on there and there. And that end, I'm guessing, must have to locate in there. Nothing much appears to have happened from there, but from there, look, there's all sorts of things going on. That's most exciting. Stubby screw. Oh, that's very nice the way that goes in there. So that's all that mechanism held in place, the reject mechanism, the speed controller, the bit that tells you what size record it is, the bit that tells you where the needle has to go to, which is dependent on what size record it is. That's incredibly clever. In some ways, that's more impressive than it being done electronically, because it has to actually physically do it. That's mechanical intelligence you've got there. I like it. I like contemplating it. It's a shame you never see all this when the thing's working. They should have made this transparent and put a mirror in the bottom of the box so you could see the mechanism. Anyway, it's not quite finished, inevitably. We've still got to put this plate on and this big spring and a few other odds and sods. Then we can start thinking about powering. We start thinking about the motor. And that means soldering. So this next plate that goes on controls the return of the arm with the stylus in. Some of it goes on from underneath, which is this bit that I'm picking up, the plate, the spring, and the usual little odds and sods. The other bit of it, the interesting bit, it's all interesting, the really interesting bit, which is the cam plate, that goes on the other side of the chassis when we turn it over. Now, I've got to be honest, the exact function of this is slightly unclear from the diagram. I'm going to say the spring goes from there right back on itself to there. Yes. That's clear of those levers, so that works. And then remember to put the little spring clip on the other end. I suppose the arrival of the Dan set was very timely, given that music was becoming, well, it was beginning the process of becoming a bit revolutionary. I don't mean in the way of Chopin's revolutionary etude. I mean, it was all about dissent, teenage dissent, which is a great thing and a very powerful thing. It meant you could go away and listen to things in secret, which meant you could put possibly slightly more salacious stuff in records because you weren't sitting next to your pipe-smoking grandpa listening to it. Having said that, this is all slightly before my time, but thinking back to records I know of that came out in that sort of early 60s period, like the early Beatles and so on, I can't think that there was anything in there that gave cause for alarm. Not like the Sex Pistols or Eminem or so on. I mean, well, love me do. It's the sort of thing my mum would say. From me to you. It was all very chaste, actually, I think. It was about people falling in love forever. But what you crave when you're 15 or whatever, you want to be left alone, don't you? You want to have your own room, your own den, or you want to be somewhere just with your mates. You don't want your mum and dad there, you don't want teachers there, you don't want policemen, guardians, vicars, priests, anybody who tells you how to live your life. So I suppose this was a form of independence, wasn't it? A bit like getting a bicycle or a car or something. That wasn't a particularly profound thought, I'm afraid. Now we have a bit of a choice here. We can continue by installing the motor, or we can break on through to the other side and finish off a few bits of the mechanism which live above the plate. I think the mechanism, let's do that. Let's get all the mechanism right, and then we'll think about power, and then we'll think about sound.
To finish the mechanism, I'll need the cam and these bearings, which allow the turntable to rotate smoothly.
We're at a point in the assembly that requires lubrication, so grease is the word. Here it is. It's a small amount, a small packet of very special record player grease. You have a bit on there, which is the pivot for the elaborate cam plate. Right, I need a bit more grease for the main bearing. This is an extremely important bit. This is where the turntable spins. If it doesn't spin freely, obviously your music will come out in a very wonky fashion. And this rather delightful ball bearing cage. Right, that's the bearing on. Now the cam plate. So let's go. There it is in the groove. Oh, it's all beginning to sound like a clunky old record player. That's good. You see as I move. All sorts of amazing things going on. Let us go to the table of componentry and find the motor. So as well as the actual motor itself, which is this big bit here, we need the rubber mounts, which isolate it from the rest of the chassis, clips and washers to hold it in place, these screws, nuts, small washers, all put the switch together and hold the cable in place on the chassis, I think. When I woke up this morning in the morning light, I put on my blue jeans and I had a slight sense of dread about putting this record player together because I thought it would be an awful thing. But actually it turns out to be strangely pleasing as a mechanical artifact. It's made out of actually very basic, to be honest, quite cheap materials. It's just bits of pressed steel, a few, I think that's some sort of zinc alloy die casting that's made out of the same stuff as, you know, toy cars. But it's actually, it's a hopeful sort of thing. It smacks of optimism and youth and joy. Okay, that's the motor in place, as simple as that. This looks incredibly complicated. And conceptually, it is complicated. I don't know how they would have designed it. They must have started with the idea of a turntable, I suppose, and then worked backwards from that, thinking, how do we make it drop another record down? How does the needle know where to go back to? And so on and so on. But actually, it's, in terms of assembly, although there's lots of it, and it is a bit baffling, it will actually only go together the way it's meant to go together. If you put something in the wrong hole, you'd know about it pretty soon afterwards because there'd be something else that obviously was meant to go in that hole. So even without the help of the diagram, which isn't actually that helpful anyway, I think you would eventually be able to do this. Yep, that has nipped up. Our record players are romantic. There's something about discs in sleeves. It's all to do with, I don't know, seduction or... I don't know. I don't know what it is about record players, but there is something about them that you don't feel about washing machines, for example, from the 1960s, or old fridges, or old cars. I mean, the old cars just leave me cold, really. They're interesting artifacts, but as things to use, they're awful. So, there should be a washer first, obviously, otherwise that's direct on top of the rubber, which would be very bad practice. One of the most infuriating experiences in the workshop or garage is to have something, I mean, to be honest, in my case, it's usually a motorcycle or a bicycle, that you've bought off someone else and you do a service on it or a bit of a checkup and you find something that's been bodged. I once had a motorcycle that I bought of somebody and I rode it through town and I thought, this is great, it works really well. And then the headlamp started smoking really aggressively. And then, to be brutally honest, it caught fire. And the reason was a short had occurred inside the headlamp between some of the wiring. A lot of the wiring in a motorcycle is behind the headlight. There was a short between a piece of frayed wiring and the case of the headlight, which would normally blow the fuse. When I eventually got the smouldering bits home, I discovered that the previous owner had obviously blown the fuse at some point and replaced it with just a piece of steel wire, which didn't fuse. So the circuit didn't break and the whole thing just melted. I had to rebuild the entire loom of the motorcycle because somebody couldn't be bothered to spend 25 pence on a fuse. That sort of thing annoys me.
After 5 hours and 38 minutes, or just about enough time to listen to Yes's Tales from Topographic Oceans, as well as the tone arm and ejector knob, I've reassembled the speed control knob, the selector arm, the cam and bearings, and the motor. Now I can finally attach the arm to the chassis.
I have to go down into the bowels of the machine. Through there. And finally, I've reattached the spring. That eventually comes to rest on there, and if we put that on, we can actually clip it to there, which keeps it safe. Then let's not worry about the wires for the motor for a moment, and let's look at the tag strip, and let's accept, shall we, between us, that it's time to do some soldering. I've got a bit of solder on the bit, and there you go. That's not bad, but it's not the purest way of doing it. The purest way is to hold the iron and the wire onto the tag, and then apply a blob of solder so that it flows around it nicely. But the problem with that, obviously, is that you need 3 arms, and that's something you'll hear people saying about soldering all the time. To do it properly, you need 3 arms. Beautiful. I think that deserves a swig of tea.
And on that note, I'm going back to the table.
2 self-tappers. And we need the grill itself, and the baffle plate, backing plate thingy, and the cabinet of the beast.
All I have to do now is attach a few wood screws, and it'll start to look like a 1963 downset Bermuda.
So by the 70s, people were putting wood on the outside of hi-fi units to make them look posh. Again, not realising that they were originally made of wood, and then people banished wood to the inside of hi-fi. Obviously, in Thatcher's Britain, everything had to look woody because we all wanted to pretend we were part of the aristocracy. Look, there is its face. And I've got to be honest, having not seen that for a long time, I was instantly transported back to a world of the Electric Light Orchestra. And I wish it hadn't happened. So I'm going to walk back over to the table of componentry, and I'm going to bring over the pre-assembled amplifier and speaker. So stand by. Now some more screws, all of those, 4 countersunk, 4 pan head types. And the mercifully pre-assembled, because that's how it came, amplifier and speaker bundle. There is a valve as well. I'm not taking that because that's just asking to get broken. God, what a shocking mess. What is all this stuff? So now inside the box, we've got all the really untidy, messy electrical stuff. There's the amplifier, there's the pots for the little control panel at the front. The speaker, I didn't solder it all together because the crew refused to tolerate that. I could do it, but you wouldn't be able to see it, so what would be the point? And anyway, that's pretty much how it would have come at the time. That would have arrived as a pre-assembled unit It would be easy to assume that all this electrical stuff is the brains of the dance set, but actually I don't think they are. This is fairly simple electronics. I think the brain of the dance set is a mechanical brain. It's all that stuff going on underneath the chassis, underneath the turntable. That's where it's impressive, I think. This stuff in here, this is just electrics rubbish. That's the speaker in, and I can still remember LP records. I mean, they were old records when I was a kid, so they were probably records that belonged to my mum and dad, but people were so excited about the idea of stereophonic sound that you'd have a record with somebody quite big, quite well known on it, like the Berlin Philharmoniker with Herbert von Karajan, but the biggest word on the cover was stereo. Herbert von Karajan plays Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Stereo! We're getting quite close here. This is really quite exciting. There are some screws to hold this plate down into the cabinet, and then we will actually attach the chassis. So let's get the knobs, these screws. Yes, that's it. It's a screw run. So there are some very significant bits going to go on here. That's just a circlip. These are the transit screws and clips. Those hold the record deck steady while you're walking along with it as a handbag, and then release it so that it sits nicely on its suspension springs. That's the arm that goes over the top of the records when they're sitting on the spike. That is the spike itself. That is I don't know what that is, but I'm sure we'll work it out. That is the turntable. That's a really exciting bit. Then over here, as promised, two knobs and the screw I forgot last time for the cable clamp. Two knobs. There's a little flat on the shaft, there's a little flat inside the knob, and it should just push on. It does. The flat on that one is at the bottom. There's the flat. There you go. Oh, what a nice click. That's the sound of old hi-fi. Good. Okay, that's us done for the moment with the case. Better keep the exploded diagram just in case. Like that. Oh. Bring this back in. I'm torn. What do I want to put on first? I think I want, yeah, control arm. No, turntable, what the hell? Let's put the turntable on. So I need the big circlip. The turntable, this is quite an important moment, I suppose. It's not a record player, really, until we've got this on. That will slide over there and engage with the teeth on the cam wheel. That's become a record player now. I mean, all a record player really is something going round and round, but there's a lot of extra stuff to turn it into an automatic record player. A straightforward record player that simply played a record, you could pretty much make yourself if you had some means of power, even if it was only a treadle. You could make the record go round and round, and if you had a sharp, pointy bit of metal and a paper cone to make a crude amplifier, you could work out what was on a record. I mean, if you think about the first records, the very first records were really the opposite of the process by which a record is played. That is, when the record is played, the groove sets up a vibration in the needle, the very tip of the needle, which is amplified electronically and then comes out of a speaker, or originally came acoustically out of a speaker, like on an old wind-up 78 gramophone. But the original records were made the other way around. The sound went into a big trumpet, and the needle vibrated and cut the groove. So the groove was the literal impression of the air on the surface of the record. It was the vibrations of the air, which is all that sound is, made visible. If you looked at them under a powerful magnifying glass, you'd have said, that's what Beethoven's Fifth Symphony looks like. And you'd be looking at sound. That's quite an interesting thought, isn't it? This is clever. This used to fascinate me when I was a kid. Record sits on there. Machine knows when it's time for the record to drop down. But it only drops one record down, doesn't it? How does it know? I do have a dim memory of occasionally no record coming down and occasionally two dropping down, which meant that if you were lucky, you could entirely miss Mr. Blue Sky.
I've been reassembling this record player for 7 hours and 23 minutes. I've assembled the chassis and cabinet and installed the amplifier and speaker. I've got a bit more soldering to do, then it'll be a bona fide tool of teenage rebellion.
Is there anything else I need to do inside there? Yes, there is. Of course there is. How foolish of me. We need to put the single valve into the amplifier. This is... Now, we're going to instigate a long discussion by any hi-fi enthusiasts watching about whether valves are actually give a warmer sound than modern electronics. Maybe they do, I don't know. They are very fragile and they are enormous. Now, this thing that looks a bit like Skylab is a valve, and it does the job that would soon be done by transistors, the small components that did so much to make radios smaller. And those are enormous by modern standards, because that job is now done by a microscopic speck on a circuit board in a chip. And I seem to remember somebody very old saying that you should never really touch these with your fingers, because the grease from your fingers can cause a hot spot to develop on the glass, which can cause them to fail. So just in case that is true, I shall polish it up and hold it with a piece of paper. It will only go in one way because of the arrangement of the pins on the end. And then there is this little springy clip that goes over the end to hold it in place. Now, had I broken that doing that, which is very easy to do because it's only made of glass, the program would have been over. Electricity is dull, and it doesn't really exist, remember. We've been into this. You just have to believe it, and it will work. It's like Indiana Jones stepping out onto that bridge that isn't there in The Last Crusade. He has to believe it's there, and it is. If he'd been a doubter, it wouldn't have been there. Oh. God, that takes me back. That was your iPod, your MP3 player. If you were a youth in the 50s and 60s. This is a bit like that telephone we looked at in the first series. The way it works, the functionality of it becomes more and more irrelevant because old technology does. It's just surpassed. But the way it looks remains important because it's part of the history of art and design, which we think is important. The way things look always matters. That is why art shall ultimately triumph. It has no utility, therefore it doesn't actually have to work in any way. Right, this is an extremely high quality French flick screwdriver. Righty-tighty. Ladies, if you're watching this thinking, my husband stroke boyfriend would probably like one of those for Christmas, you're right. He would. Oh, do we like that?
Feels to me like it's time to put the lid on.
The lid. Now, putting the lid on will make this actually not quite a complete record player because there's no stylus in it. And let's be honest, it's not a record player until it plays a record. We don't know if it's going to do that until the very end. There was a bit of a debate amongst the crew earlier on about what it was that made this truly portable. Was it the advent of a universal mains plug? Was it that it was compact? And then Dan the sound man pointed out that it's because it's got a handle on it. He might have a point. Right, that's the last of those. It's still not quite a record player because it doesn't have a stylus in it and it doesn't have a record on it. We shall sort that out, and then it's party time. Don't need my little pot for this bit. What I'm actually taking here is the cartridge. The whole assembly is the cartridge. The stylus is just the little pointy needle bit right in the very end of it. That bit is the cartridge. I'm putting it down on its side, so I'm not touching the actual styluses. Definitely need my specs for this. And this piece, oh wow, I'd completely forgotten about that. Ours had this. It actually had two different styluses in the cartridge. Like, it says 78, because people still had 78s in the olden days. Then you flipped it over for LP because the size of the point of the needle was different, because the groove size was different. I'd totally forgotten that. That's taken me right back. The stylus is really a diamond tip. We used to get very excited about it when I was a kid, because it says, like it says here in fact, fitted with genuine diamond stylus. And we thought, wow, that's amazing, it must be worth a fortune. But of course, it's a chip of industrial diamond, which is worth very little. This is an exciting moment. There you go. That's all 195 components back together. It looks like a record player. Does it sound like one? Shall we listen to a record? Yes?
Over the course of the last 8 hours and 46 minutes, I've seen a collection of disparate components gradually coalesce into something more than the sum of its parts, an enabler of romance, independence and sedition. But that's all nonsense if it won't play a record, and I've got just the record to rekindle the fire of youth in your belly.
Right, you're going to like this. This is a real classic. Oh, that's an old familiar feeling. Right, you ready? Yes!